Hello, dear listeners and lost souls. A quick omen before we begin. Tomorrow I will release a free gift for you. Subscribe so you do not miss it. Now prepare your neck. The vampire waits. London in 1908 is a city balanced precariously between past and future. Gaslights still flicker against the encroaching glow of electric bulbs, and horse-drawn carriages share cramped cobblestone streets with the first sputtering automobiles. The nights, however, remain as inky and impenetrable as ever, especially in the neglected quarters where lamplighters seldom venture. It is in such a forsaken place, down a narrow lane of crumbling row houses and shuttered shops, that I find the church. I have come here on nothing but a rumour, a tip that the demolition crew will soon arrive to reduce the building to rubble. I am a journalist by trade, though cynicism has long supplanted whatever zeal for truth I once possessed. Still, I cannot resist an abandoned structure. The promise of secrets best left undisturbed. That curiosity, more than any loyalty to truth, is what brings me to the rotting threshold of St. Matthias's. Its exterior is wreathed in a perpetual fog, the spire leaning at an impossible angle, like a skeletal finger pointing accusingly at the heavens. Windows lie shattered, their edges jagged as broken teeth. The gargoyles, once protectors perched high along the eaves, have had their faces worn down by decades of rain and wind, leaving them faceless horrors of stone. I push open the door. It squeals in protest, the echo swallowed by the vastness of a nave where broken pews fester in dust and darkness. A single beam of moonlight stabs through a gaping hole in the roof, illuminating the remnants of an altar draped in mildewed cloth. The smell is unbearable, rotting wood and stale incense layered over something sweeter, almost nauseatingly so, that I cannot quite identify. I step in. Floorboards groan beneath my weight, the building itself seeming to whisper warnings. Leave. But the hush that hangs over the place grips me. I feel compelled deeper, glancing over peeling frescoes of saints whose faces have dissolved into ghostly outlines. Then, amid the debris behind the altar, I see a stack of dusty papers, bound in a decaying leather folder. On the cover was etched, "The last confession of Sister Margaret, bride of God and whore of darkness. Let these words be my witness. Let them damn me truly." I open it, and my world shrinks to the size of the first page. My breath catches as I read the opening lines, penned in a hand both meticulous and trembling. September 7th, 1898. I am Sister Margaret of the Order of the Sacred Heart. If you are reading these pages, I beg you to heed my warning. Do not trust in piety alone to save you from evil. There are things in this world beyond the logic of our teachings. Darkness clothed in robes of divinity. Herein lies my confession. May it be my last act of contrition. We heard rumors before we saw him. A new bishop was to arrive, one favored in Rome, with a reputation for miraculous wonders. The Mother Superior hastened to prepare a modest welcome, yet even as we scrubbed corridors and polished the marble floors, I felt an unaccountable dread. I saw it in the eyes of the other sisters too, as though our prayers faltered on our tongues whenever his name was spoken. He arrived at twilight. His carriage pulled up to the convent's entrance, its horses stamping nervously at the stones. When he stepped out, I saw a tall figure swathed in black robes, face hooded by a clerical cap. We lined up to greet him, and he paused before each of us, his lips parting in what might have been called a smile, if not for its disquieting emptiness. I made the mistake of meeting his gaze. His eyes were a hue I had never seen, almost colourless, as though the life had been siphoned from them. My body chilled. I felt no relief when he moved on, for I sensed something monstrous crawling behind those pale irises. It is impossible not to feel the hairs rise on my neck as I read. The wind moans through the shattered windows. I can almost hear Sister Margaret's voice echoing from the corners of this ruined church. Outside, London's fog creeps against the door as though hungry to reclaim all traces of memory. I continue. September 15th, 1898. He calls himself Bishop Domenico, but his origins remain unknown. The Mother Superior welcomed him into our cloister, which adjoined a small chapel under the authority of the diocese. He came preaching renewal, proclaiming that our faith had grown stale. He promised revelations, intimations of the divine. The sisters fell under his spell, dazzled by his rhetorical gifts. Confession after confession they flocked to him, confiding secrets and doubts. From the start I felt only dread. Yet I tried to quell it, blaming my own weakness. I told myself I ought to admire his fierce devotion, the almost physical intensity with which he spoke of our Lord. But no matter how fervently I prayed to see the good in him, my prayers echoed back emptily. He sought me out that first night during Compline. I was alone in the chapel, finishing my penance. The sound of his robes on the stone floor made my heart thunder. "My child," he said, voice resonant as a tolling bell, "you are devout, are you not?" "Yes, Bishop," I replied, pressing my folded hands tight, as if their trembling might betray me. "You do not trust me," he observed. I could feel his stare burning into me, though I dared not lift my eyes. "But in time you will. This is the will of the Almighty." He lifted my chin with a finger colder than any living flesh. "Kneel and pray for your misguided heart, Sister Margaret." I knelt, my lips moved in automatic devotion. When I finally looked up, he was gone. Yet I sensed a presence linger, like a faint whisper in the shadowy arches. I paused to listen for any sound in the current gloom of St. Matthias's. All is still except for the quiet drip of rain leaking through the broken roof. The confession resonates in me, and I can almost taste the suffocating dread Sister Margaret felt. My candle sputters. I push aside the soaked bits of plaster and continue reading, each sentence pulling me deeper under its spell. September 25, 1898. Life at the convent changed swiftly. The bishop introduced night vigils, insisting that the sisters join him in the dark hours to atone for the world's sins. We gathered by candlelight, chanting litanies that lasted long past midnight. Our exhaustion, he said, would be rewarded with spiritual vision. Soon Sister Anne vanished. She was one of the older nuns, sweet-natured but prone to illness. The bishop told us she had been sent on a pilgrimage to Canterbury for special devotions. Days later, Sister Lucia also disappeared. Then Sister Catherine. Each time the bishop offered vague explanations, pilgrimages, retreats, transfers. Yet I saw no official letters or documents. The Mother Superior seemed enthralled, unaware or perhaps willfully blind to these bizarre absences. She hung on his every word. Her devotion bordered on mania, her eyes forever hungry for his approval. She repeated his sermons to us incessantly, urging compliance and obedience. Late one night I woke to an odd rustling down the corridor. I slipped from my bed to investigate. A single lantern burned in the hall, illuminating a procession of shadows. At the far end, I saw the bishop and one of the younger sisters, Sister Marie, frail as a sparrow. He clasped her wrist. She followed him reluctantly, stumbling. Her face glowed white with terror. I dared not follow, but I heard a low hiss, something unearthly and inhuman that made my limbs freeze in place. Then a stifled scream. The sound of it choked so abruptly that my heart nearly stopped. The next morning, Sister Marie was gone as well. Another pilgrimage, the bishop claimed. My distrust crystallized into icy certainty. Yet who could I tell? The other nuns were enthralled, either too devout or too frightened to question him. I was alone in my suspicion. Even as I read, I remind myself, I am only an observer here, nearly a decade after these events, yet the terror within these pages seeps into me like poison. I clench my teeth, feeling the hush of the church as though it's waiting for something. The very air tastes stale, like old prayers left to rot. I turn the page. October 2, 1898. I have seen him for what he is. In the dim light of the crypt beneath the chapel, where our dead sisters once lay in simple wooden coffins, he performed a rite so profane that my pen trembles to record it. Through the grate in the floor I watched him, trembling in horror. He stood at a makeshift altar, draped in black velvet embroidered with arcane symbols. Candles encircled him, their flames casting long, writhing shadows. Before him lay Sister Helen, silent, neither dead nor alive, her eyes rolled back. The bishop intoned words older than any liturgy of our church. Then he bent down, revealing a mouth not of human shape, but twisted, the lips peeled back from sharpened fangs. He sank them into her neck and drank. I bit my fist to keep from screaming. As he fed, I saw Sister Helen move, her body racked by spasms of ecstasy and agony. Her soft moans carried through the crypt like a broken hymn. When he raised his head at last, his face was smeared with blood. 2 other sisters knelt nearby, eyes vacant with reverence. One let out a sob that sounded almost like a plea for more. The bishop then offered his wrist, slicing it open with a curved, ceremonial dagger. His blood dripped into a chalice, and each sister drank from it enthralled. I watched in mute horror. Their tongues lapped at the rim, desperate to collect every last drops. I fled before I could see more. My heart pounded so fiercely I feared they might hear it, echoing under the stone arches. When I reached my bed, I clasped my rosary and prayed for dawn to bring some semblance of reason. But in the morning, the bishop preached a sermon on sacrifice and renewal, and every single sister, including those I'd seen in the crypt, gazed upon him with an adoration that made me feel ill. Sister Helen was not among them, another lost soul. My hands shake on the papers. The wind picks up outside, howling through the half-collapsed tower. I can smell the decay more pungently now. It's as though the church itself exudes the despair of that unholy crypt. I force myself to read on, a strange compulsion driving me forward, as though I, too, have become enthralled by the bishop's malignant aura. October 10, 1898. Every night more sisters disappear into the crypt. At times I hear chanting that doesn't resemble any Catholic rite. It burrows into my mind, an unholy litany that makes my skin crawl. The bishop never rests. He stalks the corridors, a ravenous presence behind every closed door. The entire convent labors under his enchantment. Only I seem resistant, though that resistance is fading as my fear cripples my ability to think or act. He cornered me yesterday in the sacristy. I was refilling the sacramental wine when he appeared behind me, moving with preternatural silence. "My child, why do you resist me?" he asked, his voice velvet soft, yet sharp with accusation. "You have a devout heart, pure and strong. I see in your eyes a faith that yearns to be tested." I steeled myself. "I cannot understand your methods, Bishop. They seem contrary to all we hold sacred." He stepped closer. I smelt incense and something else, coppery, bestial. What is sacred? A word on a page, a vow in the night. But truth is power, Sister Margaret, and the true power comes from blood. Blood is life, blood is devotion. Your church is built on sacraments of wine, but I offer the real essence. His lips curled in that parody of a smile. "In time, you will taste it for yourself." He left me trembling. When I next tried to speak to the Mother Superior, I found her eyes glassy, her lips crusted with dried blood. She murmured a single sentence that struck me cold. "He is the vessel of our salvation." Outside, thunder rumbles over London's skyline, or so it seems. Perhaps it is only a carriage rumbling across uneven cobblestones, but the effect is the same. The confession's horrors intensify, mirrored by the environment around me. The church is silent, except for the scratch of my own shallow breathing. I notice the pages have watermarks, a decade's worth of damp seeping in. Some words are smudged but still legible. The dread is suffocating now. I can hardly bear to see what remains, yet I cannot stop. October 15th, 1898. There is nowhere safe. The sisters, once gentle souls, roam the corridors at night in small packs, pale-faced and hungry. They laugh in strange, breathy tones, a laughter that suggests new and terrible appetites. I keep to my cell, barricading the door with a chair, but the bishop's presence finds me even there. In my dreams, in the flicker of candles that cast shapes on the walls. Yesterday I awoke to find Sister Agnes at my bedside, staring down at me. Her eyes were sunken pits, her skin taut like parchment. She said nothing, only stared. When I tried to move, she hissed, a wet, throaty sound, and withdrew, as if reluctant to attack me without the bishop's direct order. Am I his final conquest, the last holdout? It feels like a sick game, as if my refusal kindles his desire to break me more thoroughly. I have prayed until my throat is raw, but there is no solace. The convent is drenched in an evil that mocks all holiness. The stone walls practically pulse with it. The nights are filled with hideous sounds, muffled screams, scraping nails, and something that might be the beating of monstrous wings. I fear tomorrow. I fear the next hour. Even my faith trembles now. How can I remain steadfast when the entire house of God has fallen under the dominion of a devil in bishop's robes? My grip on the pages tightens as I register the weight of Sister Margaret's isolation. The damp chill of the church seems to intensify, swirling around me. It feels as though the spirit of that bishop still lingers here, having seeped into the very foundations. A flash of movement in my peripheral vision startles me, but it is only a rat skittering among the rubble. I read on, compelled. October 20, 1898. He has taken me, body and soul. I must commit these words quickly before my mind dissolves completely. Last night I hid in the chapel, clutching my rosary, tears scorching my cheeks. The bishop found me. He swept in through the side door, silent as a grave. Within seconds he had seized me by the throat, his strength unearthly. "Why, Sister Margaret," he said, voice smooth, "you look so frightened. Is it not your calling to offer your life to God?" He slammed me onto the altar. My skull cracked against the marble. Blood trickled down my brow, but I fought back, raking at his face. My nails found only cold flesh beneath his robes, as though he wore a corpse's skin. He smiled, parted his lips, and sank his fangs into my neck. I felt the life drain from me, each pulse of blood leaving me weaker. Darkness nibbled at the edges of my vision. Yet beneath the horror I sensed a seductive warmth, a part of me that wanted to surrender. In that moment, I understood the nun's thrall. How easy it is to let go, to melt into the ecstasy of oblivion. He did not fully drain me. Instead, he slashed his own wrist and forced me to drink. His blood scorched my throat, filling me with a raging heat that obliterated every prayer in my mind. I felt my faith waver, the cross around my neck burning against my flesh. But I drank, dear God, I drank. When he pulled away, I was changed. My vision blurred, my heart hammered, and my senses erupted in painful clarity. I saw the flicker of candlelight on every stone, felt the drop of my own blood sizzling on the altar, heard the mocking murmur of the bishop's voice echo off the vaulted ceiling. I do not know if I am alive or damned. My wounds close unnaturally fast. I crave something dark and vital, but I fight the urge. I cling to my devotion, but it slips through my fingers. If I am to remain Sister Margaret at all, I must record these final hours. It is my last anchor to who I was. My jaw clenches, my heart drumming painfully in my chest. The wind outside intensifies, rattling the dilapidated rafters of St. Matthias's. I can almost see Sister Margaret Frail trembling, writing those words while her body betrayed her. I scan the next page, tears welling in my eyes unbidden. October 21, 1898. He made me watch as the Mother Superior pledged her life to him. She knelt, drank from his wrist, and rose with eyes that blazed with diabolical lust for blood. Several other sisters knelt in turn, each one lost in that same vampiric delirium. When they turned to me, their newly minted sister in darkness, I shrank away. I remain torn, half initiated. My soul screams for mercy, but my body thrums with the bishop's blood. I yearn to yield, to accept the relief that comes with eternal night. I watch my fellow nuns prowl the convent's halls like predators. They feed on unsuspecting travellers and bury the remains in the crypt. They exult in their unholy transformation, praising the bishop as their saviour. I, alone, do not praise him. Perhaps that is why he finds me so precious. He wants my complete surrender. Tonight he will demand it. He has summoned me to the crypt at midnight. I feel the pull of his summons, a cord tugging at my very core. If I go, I am lost. If I refuse, I know he will hunt me down like prey. This is the end of me, of Margaret, of faith, of sanity. May God forgive me. The confession ends abruptly, the page torn. No date follows. No further explanation. Just a few more lines scrawled in the margin. He is coming. I cannot resist. I stare at those words. My mind reels with the finality of Sister Margaret's fate, the total corruption of the convent. I swallow hard, trying to quell the bile rising in my throat. The devastation, the unholy atrocities. Somehow they feel alive in this church, as if they took root here and never left. I rise unsteadily from where I crouched, clutching the confession as though it might vanish. The last flickers of moonlight reveal a door in the corner, leading down, a crypt. Every bone in my body demands I leave, return to my editor with a dramatic story. But some compulsion, maybe the same curiosity that brought me here, drives me to descend the spiral of stone steps. My candle guttering, I climb down, each step echoing in the darkness. A cold sweat slicks my palms. The crypt is hollow and damp. Crumbling coffins lie smashed in corners, their contents long scattered. My candle flickers on a stone altar, stained black. It looks as though an unspeakable ritual was performed here, in the very place Sister Margaret described. The residual stench of blood curls around me, oppressive even after a decade. I walk slowly, the shadows dancing. Then I see it, an alcove containing a single coffin, black wood reinforced with iron. My heart hammers as I approach. The lid is slightly ajar. The remains of a rotted rope lie around it, suggesting someone once tried to bind it shut, or perhaps tried to keep something in. I lift the lid, breath catching painfully in my lungs. Inside, a skeletal figure lies in a tattered nun's habit. A single crucifix is clutched in its bony hands, pressed against what was once its chest. Was this Sister Margaret? The bones are twisted, the jaw contorted, as though in one final scream. The crucifix is blackened, burned into the skeleton's hands, as if it seared her flesh even in death. A wave of sorrow floods me, so thick it nearly drops me to my knees. I gently, almost reverently, close the coffin again. Yet as the lid slides shut, I glimpse something else behind that coffin, a pile of mildewed cloth. I move closer, and the cloth stirs. A rat, or so I think, scampers away. My candlelight reveals an old bishop's robe, black with gold embroidery, decaying but unmistakable. A wave of nausea hits me. The bishop's presence is here, lingering like a malignant ghost. I back away, stumbling over broken shards of wood. The smell of dust and death is overwhelming. My eyes burn with tears not entirely my own, imagining Sister Margaret's final hours. The tragedy weighs on me like a physical burden. I scramble up the stairs, chest tight, and burst back into the main chapel. Outside, the first hint of dawn glimmers through the jagged windows, a pale illumination cutting through London's fog. I stand in the ruined sanctuary, clutching Sister Margaret's confession. My mind churns. Part of me wants to burn this entire church to ash, to exorcise the evil that still clings to the stones. But would that free Margaret's tormented soul, or simply bury her story? I linger in indecision. The confession pulses in my grasp like a living thing, demanding to be known, to be read, to be believed. If I hand it to my editor, it will become sensational headlines or cast aside as lurid fiction. But how can I keep silent? Sister Margaret wrote these words as a final act of faith, or at least some shred of it. My eyes travel across the ruined pews. In the half-light, I see dark stains on the flagstones, evidence of old blood. The church feels as though it might heave a final breath and crumble into its own damnation. I sense it, an ancient hunger, the memory of that bishop's monstrous presence. Perhaps he left years ago, or maybe he never left at all. Eventually I walk to the battered door, ignoring the weight of centuries pressing upon me. I step out into the fog-laden street. Rain patters softly, washing some of the dread from my skin. I press Sister Margaret's confession to my chest. It's a burden I can't unshoulder. In the end, I do not think I will publish it. Who would believe such a horror? Who could possibly accept that a devil once masqueraded as a bishop and devoured an entire convent from within? And yet, to destroy the confession would be a second betrayal. I am trapped in the knowledge. It cannot be unseen. 2 days later, the demolition begins. I stand at a distance, the photograph of Sister Margaret's final resting place burned into my mind. The wrecking ball slams into the old walls, toppling the spire with an echoing crash. St. Matthias's collapses in a cloud of dust and centuries of secrets. No one else hears the faint whisper that might be the dying moan of the bishop's legacy, or perhaps the final sigh of Sister Margaret's soul escaping at last. I remain motionless as the rubble settles, my heart hollow. I find myself praying for her, though I have not prayed for anyone in years. I pray that her confession was enough, that in the end she found some measure of release from the evil that defiled her. Later I drift home, battered by the knowledge I've gained. London moves on, indifferent. Carriages rattle by, children shout in alleyways, and the newspapers hawk mundane stories of politics and scandal. I clutch the confession tucked in my coat, a secret testament. I can already feel it festering in my thoughts. For I know that evil is no fairy tale. It is real, it breathes, it feeds, and it cloaks itself in piety if it chooses. And I know too that the line between faith and darkness, between surrender and defiance, is razor thin. All that remains now is the haunting awareness that somewhere, in some forgotten crypt or overshadowed chapel, that ancient hunger might rise again. I walk the fog-shrouded streets, the hush of twilight settling over the city. The final lines of Sister Margaret's confession echo in my mind, a whispered litany of doom. He is coming, I cannot resist. I shiver, though I do not look back. If there is any solace to be found, it is in letting the past crumble alongside St. Matthias's. Yet I carry her words, a living curse, etched into my memory. The knowledge that evil once stood in the pulpit and drank the blood of the devout will haunt me for the rest of my days. And though London's great city heart beats on, heedless of one man's revelation, I cannot help but fear that somewhere in its hidden byways, behind another rotting door, a bishop in black robes stands smiling, fangs bared, waiting for the next faithful soul to kneel. My father was the head of a celebrated firm of church restorers and decorators about 60 years ago. He took a keen interest in his work and made an especial study of any old legends or family histories that came under his observation. He was necessarily very well read and thoroughly well posted in all questions of folklore and medieval legend. As he kept a careful record of every case he investigated, the manuscripts he left at his death have a special interest. From amongst them, I have selected the following as being a particularly weird and extraordinary experience. In presenting it to the public, I feel it is superfluous to apologize for its supernatural character. My father's diary. 1841, June 17th. Received a commission from my old friend Peter Grant to enlarge and restore the chancel of his church at Haggerstone in the wilds of the West Country. July 5th. Went down to Haggerstone with my head man, Summers, a very long and tiring journey. July 7th. Got the work well started. The old church is one of special interest to the antiquarian, and I shall endeavour while restoring it to alter the existing arrangements as little as possible. One large tomb, however, must be moved bodily 10 feet at least to the southward. Curiously enough, there is a somewhat forbidding inscription upon it in Latin, and I am sorry that this particular tomb should have to be moved. It stands amongst the graves of the Kenyans, an old family which has been extinct in these parts for centuries. The inscription on it runs thus: Sarah, 1630. For the sake of the dead and the welfare of the living, let this sepulchre remain untouched and its occupant undisturbed till the coming of Christ. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. July 8th. Took counsel with Grant concerning the Sarah tomb. We are both very loath to disturb it, but the ground has sunk so beneath it that the safety of the church is in danger. Thus we have no choice. However, the work shall be done as reverently as possible under our own direction. Grant says there is a legend in the neighborhood that it is the tomb of the last of the Kenyans, the evil Countess Sarah, who was murdered in 1630. She lived quite alone in the old castle, whose ruins still stand 3 miles from here on the road to Bristol. Her reputation was an evil one even for those days. She was a witch or werewoman, the only companion of her solitude being a familiar in the shape of a huge Asiatic wolf. This creature was reputed to seize upon children, or failing these, sheep and other small animals, and convey them to the castle, where the Countess used to suck their blood. It was popularly supposed that she could never be killed. This, however, proved a fallacy, since she was strangled one day by a mad peasant woman who had lost 2 children, she declaring that they had both been seized and carried off by the Countess's familiar. This is a very interesting story, since it points to a local superstition very similar to that of the vampire, existing in Slavonic and Hungarian Europe. The tomb is built of black marble, surmounted by an enormous slab of the same material. On the slab is a magnificent group of figures. A young and handsome woman reclines upon a couch. Round her neck is a piece of rope, the end of which she holds in her hand. At her side is a gigantic dog with bared fangs and lolling tongue. The face of the reclining figure is a cruel one. The corners of the mouth are curiously lifted, showing the sharp points of long canine or dog teeth. The whole group, though magnificently executed, leaves a most unpleasant sensation. If we move the tomb, it will have to be done in 2 pieces, the covering slab first, and then the tomb proper. We have decided to remove the covering slab tomorrow, July 9th, 6 p.m. A very strange day. By noon everything was ready for lifting off the covering stone, and after the men's dinner we started the jacks and pulleys. The slab lifted easily enough, though if fitted closely into its seat, and was further secured by some sort of mortar or putty, which must have kept the interior perfectly airtight. None of us were prepared for the horrible rush of foul, mouldy air that escaped as the cover lifted clear of its seating. And the contents that gradually came into view were more startling still. There lay the fully dressed body of a woman, wizened and shrunk and ghastly pale, as if from starvation. Round her neck was a loose cord, and, judging by the scars still visible, the story of death of strangulation was true enough. The most horrible part, however, was the extraordinary freshness of the body. Except for the appearance of starvation, life might have been only just extinct. The flesh was soft and white. The eyes were wide open and seemed to stare at us with a fearful understanding in them. The body itself lay on mould, without any pretense to coffin or shell. For several moments we gazed with horrible curiosity, and then it became too much for my workmen, who implored us to replace the covering slab. That, of course, we would not do, but I set the carpenters to work at once to make a temporary cover while we moved the tomb to its new position. This is a long job, and will take 2 or 3 days at least. July 9th, 9 p.m. Just at sunset, we were startled by the howling of, seemingly, every dog in the village. It lasted for 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour, and then ceased as suddenly as it began. This, and a curious mist that has risen round the church, makes me feel rather anxious about the Sarah tomb. According to the best established traditions of the vampire-haunted countries, the disturbance of dogs or wolves at sunset is supposed to indicate the presence of one of these fiends, and local fog is always considered to be a certain sign. The vampire has the power of producing it for the purpose of concealing its movements near its hiding place at any time. I dare not mention or even hint my fears to the rector, for he is, not unnaturally perhaps, a rank disbeliever in many things that I know from experience are not only possible, but even probable. I must work this out alone at first, and get his aid without his knowing in what direction he is helping me. I shall now watch till midnight at least. 10:15 p.m., as I feared and half expected. Just before 10 there was another outburst of the hideous howling. It was commenced most distinctly by a particularly horrible and blood-curdling wail from the vicinity of the churchyard. The chorus lasted only a few minutes, however, and at the end of it I saw a large dark shape, like a huge dog, emerge from the fog and lope away at a rapid canter towards the open country. Assuming this to be what I fear, I shall see it return soon after midnight. 12:30 p.m. I was right. Almost as midnight struck, I saw the beast returning. It stopped at the spot where the fog seemed to commence, and lifting up its head, gave tongue to that particularly horrible, long-drawn wail that I had noticed as preceding the outburst earlier in the evening. Tomorrow I shall tell the rector what I have seen, and if, as I expect, we hear of some neighbouring sheepfold having been raided, I shall get him to watch with me for this nocturnal marauder. I shall also examine the Sarah tomb for something which he may notice without any previous hint from me. July 10th. I found the workmen this morning much disturbed in mind about the howling of the dogs. "We doen't like it," one of them said to me. "We doen't like it. There was summat abroad last night that was unholy." They were still more uncomfortable when the news came round that a large dog had made a raid upon a flock of sheep, scattering them far and wide, and leaving 3 of them dead with torn throats in the field. When I told the rector of what I had seen and what was being said in the village, he immediately decided that we must try and catch, or at least identify, the beast I had seen. "Of course," said he, "it is some dog lately imported into the neighbourhood, for I know of nothing about here nearly as large as the animal you describe, though its size may be due to the deceptive moonlight." This afternoon I asked the rector, as a favour, to assist me in lifting the temporary cover that was on the tomb, giving as an excuse the reason that I wished to obtain a portion of the curious mortar with which it had been sealed. After a slight demur, he consented, and we raised the lid. If the sight that met our eyes gave me a shock, at least it appalled Grant. "Great God!" he exclaimed, "the woman is alive!" And so it seemed for a moment. The corpse had lost much of its starved appearance, and looked hideously fresh and alive. It was still wrinkled and shrunken, but the lips were firm, and of the rich red hue of health. The eyes, if possible, were more appalling than ever, though fixed and staring. At one corner of the mouth I thought I noticed a slight dark-coloured froth, but I said nothing about it then. "Take your piece of mortar, Harry," gasped Grant, "and let us shut the tomb again. God help me. Parson though I am, such dead faces frighten me." Nor was I sorry to hide that terrible face again, but I got my bit of mortar, and I have advanced a step towards the solution of the mystery. This afternoon the tomb was moved several feet towards its new position, but it will be 2 or 3 days yet before we shall be ready to replace the slab. 10:15 p.m. Again the same howling at sunset, the same fog enveloping the church, and at 10 o'clock the same great beast slipping silently out into the open country. I must get the rector's help and watch for its return. But precautions we must take, for if things are as I believe, we take our lives in our hands when we venture out into the night to waylay the vampire. Why not admit it at once, for that the beast I have seen is the vampire of that evil thing in the tomb I can have no reasonable doubt. Not yet come to its full strength, thank heaven, after the starvation of nearly 2 centuries, for at present it can only maraud as wolf, apparently. But in a day or 2, when full power returns, that dreadful woman in new strength and beauty will be able to leave her refuge. Then it would not be sheep merely that would satisfy her disgusting lust for blood, but victims that would yield the life-blood without a murmur to her caressing touch. Victims that, dying of her foul embrace, themselves must become vampires in their turn, to prey on others. Mercifully, my knowledge gives me a safeguard. For that little piece of mortar that I rescued today from the tomb contains a portion of the sacred host, and who holds it, humbly and firmly believing in its virtue, may pass safely through such an ordeal as I intend to submit myself and the rector to tonight. 12:30 p.m. Our adventure is over for the present, and we are back safe. After writing the last entry recorded above, I went off to find Grant and tell him that the marauder was out on the prowl again. "But, Grant," I said, "before we start out tonight, I must insist that you will let me prosecute this affair in my own way. You must promise to put ourselves completely under my orders, without asking any questions as to the why and wherefore." After a little demur, and some excusable chaff on his part at the serious view I was taking of what he called a dog hunt, he gave me his promise. I then told him that we were to watch tonight and try and track the mysterious beast, but not to interfere with it in any wex. I think, in spite of his jests, that I impressed him with the fact that there might be, after all, good reason for my precautions. It was just after 11 when we stepped out into the still night. Our first move was to try and penetrate the dense fog round the church, but there was something so chilly about it, and a faint smell so disgustingly rank and loathsome, that neither our nerves nor our stomachs were proof against it. Instead, We stationed ourselves in the dark shadow of a yew tree that commanded a good view of the wicket entrance to the churchyard. At midnight the howling of the dogs began again, and in a few minutes we saw a large grey shape, with green eyes shining like lamps, shamble swiftly down the path towards us. The rector started forward, but I laid a firm hand upon his arm and whispered a warning. "Remember!" Then we both stood very still and watched as the great beast cantered swiftly by. It was real enough, for we could hear the clicking of its nails on the stone flags. It passed within a few yards of us, and seemed to be nothing more nor less than a great grey wolf, thin and gaunt, with bristling hair and dripping jaws. It stopped where the mist commenced and turned round. It was truly a horrible sight, and made one's blood run cold. The eyes burnt like fires. The upper lip was snarling and raised, showing the great canine teeth, while round the mouth clung and dripped a dark-coloured froth. It raised its head and gave tongue to its long, wailing howl, which was answered from afar by the village dogs. After standing for a few moments, it turned and disappeared into the thickest part of the fog. Very shortly afterwards the atmosphere began to clear, and within 10 minutes the mist was all gone, the dogs in the village were silent, and the night seemed to reassume its normal aspect. We examined the spot where the beast had been standing, and found, plainly enough upon the stone flags, dark spots of froth and saliva. "Well, Rector," I said, "will you admit now, in view of the things you have seen today, in consideration of the legend, the woman in the tomb, the fog, the howling dogs, and, last but not least, the mysterious beast you have seen so close, that there is something not quite normal in it all? Will you put yourself unreservedly in my hands and help me, whatever I may do, to first make assurance doubly sure, and finally take the necessary steps for putting an end to this horror of the night?" I saw that the uncanny influence of the night was strong upon him, and wished to impress it as much as possible. "Needs must," he replied. "When the devil drives, and in the face of what I have seen, I must believe that some unholy forces are at work. Yet how can they work in the sacred precincts of a church? Shall we not call rather upon heaven to assist us in our need?" "Grant," I said solemnly, "that we must do, each in his own way. God helps those who help themselves, and by his help and the light of my knowledge, we must fight this battle for him and the poor lost soul within." We then returned to the rectory and to our rooms, though I have sat up to write this account while the scene is fresh in my mind. July 11th. Found the workmen again very much disturbed in their minds and full of a strange dog that had been seen during the night by several people who had hunted it. Farmer Stotman, who had been watching his sheep, the same flock that had been raided the night before, had surprised it over a fresh carcass and tried to drive it off, but its size and fierceness so alarmed him that he had beaten a hasty retreat for a gun. When he returned, the animal was gone, though he found that 3 more sheep from his flock were dead and torn. The Sarah tomb was moved today to its new position, but it was a long, heavy business, and there was not time to replace the covering slab. For this I was glad, as in the prosaic light of day the rector almost disbelieves the events of the night, and is prepared to think everything to have been magnified and distorted by our imagination. As, however, I could not possibly proceed with my war of extermination against this foul thing without assistance, and as there is nobody else I can rely upon, I appealed to him for one more night, to convince him that it was no delusion, but a ghastly, horrible truth, which must be fought and conquered for our own sakes, as well as that of all those living in the neighbourhood. "Put yourself in my hands, Rector," I said, "for tonight at least. Let us take those precautions which my study of the subject tells me are the right ones. Tonight you and I must watch in the church, and I feel assured that tomorrow you will be as convinced as I am, and be equally prepared to take those awful steps which I know to be proper, and I must warn you that we shall find a more startling change in the body lying there than you noticed yesterday." My words came true, for on raising the wooden cover once more, the rank stench of a slaughterhouse arose, making us feel positively sick. There lay the vampire, but how changed from the starved and shrunken corpse we saw 2 days ago for the first time. The wrinkles had almost disappeared, the flesh was firm and full, the crimson lips grinned horribly over the long pointed teeth, and a distinct smear of blood had trickled down one corner of the mouth. We set our teeth, however, and hardened our hearts. Then we replaced the cover and put what we had collected into a safe place in the vestry. Yet even now Grant could not believe that there was any real or pressing danger concealed in that awful tomb, as he raised strenuous objections to any apparent desecration of the body without further proof. This he shall have tonight. God grant that I am not taking too much on myself. If there is any truth in old legends, it would be easy enough to destroy the vampire now. But Grant will not have it. I hope for the best of this night's work, but the danger in waiting is very great. 6 p.m. I have prepared everything, the sharp knives, the pointed stake, fresh garlic, and the wild dog roses. All these I have taken and concealed in the vestry, where we can get at them when our solemn vigil commences. If either or both of us die with our fearful task undone, let those reading my record see that this is done. I lay it upon them as a solemn obligation, that the vampire be pierced through the heart with the stake. Then let the burial service be read over the poor clay at last released from its doom. Thus shall the vampire cease to be, and a lost soul rest. July 12th. All is over. After the most terrible night of watching and horror, one vampire at least will trouble the world no more. But how thankful should we be to a merciful providence that that awful tomb was not disturbed by anyone not having the knowledge necessary to deal with its dreadful occupant. I write this with no feelings of self-complacency, but simply with a great gratitude for the years of study I have been able to devote to this special subject. And now, to my tale. Just before sunset last night, the rector and I locked ourselves into the church and took up our position in the pulpit. It was one of those pulpits to be found in some churches, which is entered from the vestry, the preacher appearing at a good height through an arched opening in the wall. This gave us a sense of security, which we felt we needed, a good view of the interior, and direct access to the implements which I had concealed in the vestry. The sun set, and the twilight gradually deepened and faded. There was, so far, no sign of the usual fog, nor any howling of the dogs. At 9 o'clock the moon rose, and her pale light gradually flooded the aisles, and still no sign of any kind from the Sarah tomb. The rector had asked me several times what he might expect, but I was determined that no words or thought of mine should influence him, and that he should be convinced by his own senses alone. By 10:30 we were both getting very tired, and I began to think that perhaps after all we should see nothing that night. However, soon after 11, we observed a light mist rising from the Sarah tomb. It seemed to scintillate and sparkle as it rose, and curled in a sort of pillar or spiral. I said nothing, but I heard the rector give a sort of gasp as he clutched my arm feverishly. "Great heaven," he whispered, "it is taking shape." And, true enough, in a very few moments we saw standing erect by the tomb the ghastly figure of the Countess Sarah. She looked thin and haggard still, and her face was deadly white, but the crimson lips looked like a hideous gash in the pale cheeks, and her eyes glared like red coals in the gloom of the church. It was a fearful thing to watch as she stepped unsteadily down the aisle, staggering a little as if from weakness and exhaustion. This was perhaps natural, as her body must have suffered much physically from her long incarceration, in spite of the unholy forces which kept it fresh and well. We watched her to the door and wondered what would happen, but it appeared to present no difficulty, for she melted through it and disappeared. "Now, Grant," I said, "do you believe?" "Yes," he replied, "I must. Everything is in your hands, and I will obey your commands to the letter, if you can only instruct me how to rid my poor people of this unnameable terror." "By God's help I will," said I, "but you shall be yet more convinced first, for we have a terrible work to do, and much to answer for in the future, before we leave the church again this morning. And now to work, for in its present weak state the vampire will not wander far, but may return at any time, and must not find us unprepared." We stepped down from the pulpit, and taking dog roses and garlic from the vestry, proceeded to the tomb. I arrived first, and throwing off the wooden cover, cried, "Look, it is empty!" There was nothing there, nothing except the impress of the body in the loose damp mould. I took the flowers and laid them in a circle round the tomb, for legend teaches us that vampires will not pass over these particular blossoms if they can avoid it. Then, 8 or 10 feet away, I made a circle on the stone pavement, large enough for the rector and myself to stand in, and within the circle I placed the implements that I had brought into the church with me. "Now," I said, "from this circle, which nothing unholy can step across, you shall see the vampire face to face, and see her afraid to cross that other circle of garlic and dog roses to regain her unholy refuge. But on no account step beyond the holy place you stand in, for the vampire has a fearful strength not her own, and like a snake can draw her victim willingly to his own destruction." Now, so far my work was done, and calling the rector, we stepped into the holy circle to await the vampire's return. Nor was this long delayed. Presently a damp, cold odour seemed to pervade the church, which made our hair bristle and flesh to creep. And then, down the aisle with noiseless feet, came that which we watched for. I heard the rector mutter a prayer, and I held him tightly by the arm, for he was shivering violently. Long before we could distinguish the features, we saw the glowing eyes and the crimson, sensual mouth. She went straight to her tomb, but stopped short when she encountered my flowers. She walked right round the tomb, seeking a place to enter, and as she walked, she saw us. A spasm of diabolical hate and fury passed over her face, but it quickly vanished, and a smile of love, more devilish still, took its place. She stretched out her arms towards us. Then we saw that round her mouth gathered a bloody froth, and from under her lips long pointed teeth gleamed and champed. She spoke, a soft, soothing voice, a voice that carried a spell with it, and affected us both strangely, particularly the rector. I wished to test as far as possible, without endangering our lives, the vampire's power. Her voice had a soporific effect, which I resisted easily enough, but which seemed to throw the rector into a sort of trance. More than this, it seemed to compel him to her, in spite of his efforts to resist. "Come," she said. "Come, I give sleep and peace, sleep and peace, sleep and peace." She advanced a little towards us, but not far, for I noted that the sacred circle seemed to keep her back like an iron hand. My companion seemed to become demoralized and spellbound. He tried to step forward and, finding me detain him, whispered, "Harry, let go. I must go. She is calling me. I must. Oh, help me, help me." And he began to struggle. It was time to finish. "Grant," I cried in a loud, firm voice, "in the name of all that you hold sacred, have done, and play the man." He shuddered violently and gasped, "Where am I?" Then he remembered and clung to me convulsively for a moment. At this, a look of damnable hate changed the smiling face before us, and with a sort of shriek she staggered back. "Back," I cried, "back to your unholy tomb. No longer shall you molest the suffering world. Your end is near." It was fear that now showed itself in her beautiful face, for it was beautiful in spite of its horror. As she shrank back and over the circlet of flowers, shivering as she did so. At last, with a low, mournful cry, she appeared to melt back again into her tomb. As she did so, the first gleams of the rising sun lit up the world, and I knew all danger was over for the day. Taking Grant by the arm, I drew him with me out of the circle and led him to the tomb. There lay the vampire once more, still in her living death as we had a moment before seen her in her devilish life. But in the eyes remained that awful expression of hate and cringing, appalling fear. Grant is pulling himself together. "Now," I said, "will you dare the last terrible act and rid the world forever of this horror?" "By God," he said solemnly, "I will. Tell me what to do." "Help me to lift her out of her tomb. She can harm us no more," I replied. With averted faces we set to our terrible task and laid her out upon the flags. "Now," I said, "read the burial service over the poor body, and then let us give it its release from this living hell that holds it." Reverently the rector read the beautiful words, and reverently I made the necessary responses. When it was over, I took the stake and, without giving myself time to think, plunged it with all my strength through the heart. As though really alive, the body for a moment writhed and kicked convulsively, and an awful heart-rending shriek woke the silent church. Then all was still. Then we lifted the poor body back, and thank God, the consolation that legend tells is never denied to those who have to do such awful work as ours, came at last. Over the face stole a great and solemn peace. The lips lost their crimson hue. The prominent sharp teeth sank back into the mouth, and for a moment we saw before us the calm, pale face of a most beautiful woman who smiled as she slept. A few minutes more, and she faded away to dust before our eyes as we watched. We set to work and cleaned up every trace of our work, and then departed for the rectory. Most thankful were we to step out of the church, with its horrible associations, into the rosy warmth of the summer morning. With the above end the notes in my father's diary, though a few days later this further entry occurs. July 15th. Since the 12th, everything has been quiet and as usual. We replaced and sealed up the Sarah tomb this morning. The workmen were surprised to find the body had disappeared, but took it to be the natural result of exposing it to the air. One odd thing came to my ears today. It appears that the child of one of the villagers strayed from home the night of the 11th of the current month, and was found asleep in a coppice near the church, very pale and quite exhausted. There were 2 small marks on her throat, which have since disappeared. What does this mean? I have, however, kept it to myself, as, now that the vampire is no more, no further danger either to that child or any other is to be apprehended. It is only those who die of the vampire's embrace that become vampires at death in their turn. We had dined at sunset on the broad roof of the old tower, because it was cooler there during the great heat of summer. Besides, the little kitchen was built at one corner of the great square platform, which made it more convenient than if the dishes had to be carried down the steep stone steps, broken in places and everywhere worn with age. The tower was one of those built all down the west coast of Calabria by the Emperor Charles V, early in the 16th century, to keep off the Barbary pirates, when the unbelievers were allied with Francis I against the Emperor and the Church. They have gone to ruin. A few still stand intact, and mine is one of the largest. How it came into my possession 10 years ago, and why I spend a part of each year in it, are matters which do not concern this tale. The tower stands in one of the loneliest spots in southern Italy, at the extremity of a curving rocky promontory, which forms a small but safe natural harbour at the southern extremity of the Gulf of Policastro, and just north of Cape Scaia, the birthplace of Judas Iscariot, according to the old local legend. The tower stands alone on this hooked spur of the rock, and there is not a house to be seen within 3 miles of it. When I go there, I take a couple of sailors, one of whom is a fair cook, and when I am away, it is in charge of a gnome-like little being who was once a miner and who attached himself to me long ago. My friend, who sometimes visits me in my summer solitude, is an artist by profession, a Scandinavian by birth, and a cosmopolitan by force of circumstances. We had dined at sunset. The sunset glow had reddened and faded again, and the evening purple steeped the vast chain of the mountains that embrace the deep gulf to eastward, and rear themselves higher and higher towards the south. It was hot, and we sat at the landward corner of the platform, waiting for the night breeze to come down from the lower hills. The colour sank out of the air. There was a little interval of deep gay twilight, and a lamp sent a yellow streak from the open door of the kitchen, where the men were getting their supper. Then the moon rose suddenly above the crest of the promontory, flooding the platform and lighting up every little spur of rock and knoll of grass below us, down to the edge of the motionless water. My friend lighted his pipe and sat looking at a spot on the hillside. I knew that he was looking at it, and for a long time past I had wondered whether he would ever see anything there that would fix his attention. I knew that spot well. It was clear that he was interested at last, though it was a long time before he spoke. Like most painters, he trusts to his own eyesight, as a lion trusts his strength and a stag his speed, and he is always disturbed when he cannot reconcile what he sees with what he believes that he ought to see. "It's strange," he said. "Do you see that little mound just on this side of the boulder?" "Yes," I said, and I guessed what was coming. "It looks like a grave," observed Holger. "Very true, it does look like a grave." "Yes," continued my friend, his eyes still fixed on the spot. "But the strange thing is that I see the body lying on the top of it." "Of course," continued Holger, turning his head on one side as artists do. "It must be an effect of light. In the first place, it is not a grave at all. Secondly, if it were, the body would be inside and not outside. Therefore, it's an effect of the moonlight. Don't you see it?" "Perfectly. I always see it on moonlight night." "It doesn't seem it interests you much," said Holger. "On the contrary, it does interest me, though I am used to it. You're not so far wrong either. The mound is really a grave." "Nonsense," cried Holger incredulously. "I suppose you'll tell me that what I see lying on it is really a corpse." "No," I answered. "It's not. I know, because I have taken the trouble to go down and see." "Then what is it?" asked Holger. "It's nothing." "You mean that it's an effect of light, I suppose?" "Perhaps it is. But the inexplicable part of the matter is that it makes no difference whether the moon is rising or setting, or waxing or waning. If there's any moonlight at all, from east or west or overhead, so long as it shines on the grave, you can see the outline of the body on top." Holger stirred up his pipe with the point of his knife, and then used his finger for a stopper. When the tobacco burned well, he rose from his chair. "If you don't mind," he said, I'll go down and take a look at it." He left me, crossed the roof, and disappeared down the dark steps. I did not move, but sat looking down until he came out of the tower below. I heard him humming an old Danish song as he crossed the open space in the bright moonlight, going straight to the mysterious mound. When he was 10 paces from it, Holger stopped short, made 2 steps forward, and then 3 or 4 backward, and then stopped again. I know what that meant. He had reached the spot where the thing ceased to be visible, where, as he would have said, the effect of light changed. Then he went on till he reached the mound and stood upon it. I could see the thing still, but it was no longer lying down. It was on its knees now, winding its white arms round Holger's body and looking up into his face. A cool breeze stirred my hair at that moment, as the night wind began to come down from the hills, but it felt like a breath from another world. The thing seemed to be trying to climb to its feet, helping itself up by Holger's body while he stood upright, quite unconscious of it, and apparently looking toward the tower, which is very picturesque when the moonlight falls upon it on that side. "Come along," I shouted. "Don't stay there all night." It seemed to me that he moved reluctantly as he stepped from the mound, or else with difficulty. That was it. The thing's arms were still round his waist, but its feet could not leave the grave. As he came slowly forward, it was drawn and lengthened like a wreath of mist, thin and white, till I saw distinctly that Holger shook himself, as a man does who feels a chill. At the same instant a little wail of pain came to me on the breeze. It might have been the cry of the small owl that lives amongst the rocks, and the misty presence floated swiftly back from Holger's advancing figure, and lay once more at its length upon the mound. Again I felt the cool breeze in my hair, and this time an icy thrill of dread ran down my spine. I remembered very well that I had once gone down there alone in the moonlight, that presently being near I had seen nothing, that like Holger I had gone and had stood upon the mound, and I remembered how, when I came back, sure that there was nothing there, I had felt the sudden conviction that there was something after all, if I would only look back, a temptation I had resisted as unworthy of a man of sense, until, to get rid of it, I had shaken myself just as Holger did. And now I knew that those white, misty arms had been round me too. I knew it in a flash, and I shuddered as I remembered that I had heard the night owl then too. But it had not been the night owl. It was the cry of the thing. I refilled my pipe and poured out a cup of strong southern wine. In less than a minute, Holger was seated beside me again. "Of course there's nothing there," he said, "but it's creepy all the same. Do you know, when I was coming back, I was so sure that there was something behind me that I wanted to turn around and look. It was an effort not to." He laughed a little, knocked the ashes out of his pipe and poured himself out some wine. For a while neither of us spoke, and the moon rose higher and we both looked at the thing that lay on the mound. "You might make a story about that," said Holger after a long time. "There is one," I answered. "If you're not sleepy, I'll tell it to you." "Go ahead," said Holger, who liked stories. "Old Aderio was dying up there in the village beyond the hill. You remember him, I have no doubt. They say that he made his money by selling sham jewelry in South America and escaped with his gains when he was found out. Like all those fellows, if they bring anything back with them, he at once set to work to enlarge his house, and as there are no masons here, he sent all the way to Paula for 2 workmen. They were a rough-looking pair of scoundrels, a Neapolitan who had lost one eye, and a Sicilian with an old scar 1/2 an inch deep across his left cheek. I often saw them, for on Sundays they used to come down here and fish off the rocks. When Ilario caught the fever that killed him, the masons were still at work. As he had agreed that part of their pay should be their board and lodging, he made them sleep in the house. His wife was dead, and he had an only son called Angelo, who was a much better sort than himself. Angelo was to marry the daughter of the richest man in the village, and, strange to say, though the marriage was arranged by their parents, the young people were said to be in love with each other. For that matter, the whole village was in love with Angelo, and among the rest a wild, good-looking creature called Christina, who was more like a gypsy than any girl I ever saw about here. She had very red lips and very black eyes. She was built like a greyhound, and had the tongue of the devil. But Angelo did not care a straw for her. He was rather a simple-minded fellow, quite different from his old scoundrel of a father, and under what I should call normal circumstances I really believe that he would never have looked at any girl except the nice, plump little creature with a fat dowry whom his father meant him to marry. But things turned up which were neither normal nor natural. On the other hand, a very handsome young shepherd from the hills above Maratea was in love with Christina, who seems to have been quite indifferent to him. Christina had no regular means of subsistence, but she was a good girl, and willing to do any work or go on errands to any distance for the sake of a loaf of bread or a mess of beans, and permission to sleep under cover. She was especially glad when she could get something to do about the house of Angelo's father. There is no doctor in the village, and when the neighbours saw that old Ilario was dying, they sent Christina to Scalea to fetch one. That was late in the afternoon, and if they had waited so long it was because the dying miser refused to allow any such extravagance while he was able to speak. But while Christina was gone, matters grew rapidly worse. The priest was brought to the bedside, and when he had done what he could, he gave it as his opinion to the bystanders that the old man was dead, and left the house. You know these people. They have a physical horror of death. Until the priest spoke, the room had been full of people. The words were hardly out of his mouth before it was empty. It was night now. They hurried down the dark steps and out into the street. Angelo, as I have said, was away. Christina had not come back. The simple woman-servant who had nursed the sick man fled with the rest, and the body was left alone in the flickering light of the earthen oil lamp. 5 minutes later, 2 men looked in cautiously and crept forward toward the bed. They were the one-eyed Neapolitan mason and his Sicilian companion. They knew what they wanted. In a moment, they had dragged from under the bed a small but heavy iron-bound box, and long before anyone thought of coming back to the dead man, they had left the house and the village under cover of darkness. It was easy enough, for Ilario's house is the last toward the gorge which leads down here, and the thieves merely went out by the back door, got over the stone wall, and had nothing to risk after that, except that possibility of meeting some belated countryman, which was very small indeed, since few of the people used that path. They had a mattock and shovel, and they made their way without accident. I am telling you this story as it must have happened, for of course there were no witnesses to this part of it. The men brought the box down by the gorge, intending to bury it on the beach in the wet sand, where it would have been much safer. But the paper would have rotted if they had been obliged to leave it there long, so they dug their hole down there, close to that boulder. Yes, just where the mound is now. Christina did not find the doctor in Scalea, for he had been sent for from a place up the valley, halfway to San Domenico. If she had found him, we would have come on his mule by the upper road, which is smoother but much longer. But Christina took the shortcut by the rocks, which passes about 50 feet above the mound and goes round that corner. The men were digging when she passed, and she heard them at work. It would not have been like her to go by without finding out what the noise was, for she was never afraid of anything in her life. And besides, the fishermen sometimes come ashore here at night to get a stone for an anchor or to gather sticks to make a little fire. The night was dark, and Christina probably came close to the 2 men before she could see what they were doing. She knew them, of course, and they knew her, and understood instantly that they were in her power. There was only one thing to be done for their safety, and they did it. They knocked her on the head, they dug the hole deep, and they buried her quickly with the iron-bound chest. They must have understood that their only chance of escaping suspicion lay in getting back to the village before their absence was noticed, for they returned immediately, and were found half an hour later gossiping quietly with the man who was making Ilario's coffin. He was a crony of theirs, and had been working at the repairs in the old man's house. So far as I have been able to make out, the only persons who were supposed to know where Ilario kept his treasure were Angelo and the one woman-servant I have mentioned. Angelo was away. It was the woman who discovered the theft. It was easy enough to understand why no one else knew where the money was. The old man kept his door locked and the key in his pocket when he was out, and did not let the woman enter to clean the place unless he was there himself. The whole village knew that he had money somewhere, however, and the masons had probably discovered the whereabouts of the chest by climbing in at the window in his absence. If the old man had not been delirious until he lost consciousness, he would have been in frightful agony of mind for his riches. The faithful woman-servant forgot their existence only for a few moments when she fled with the rest, overcome by the horror of death. 20 minutes had not passed before she returned with the 2 hideous old hags, who were always called in to prepare the dead for burial. Even then she had not at first the courage to go near the bed with them, but she made a pretense of dropping something, went down on her knees as if to find it, and looked under the bedstead. The walls of the room were newly whitewashed down to the floor, and she saw at a glance that the chest was gone. It had been there in the afternoon. It had therefore been stolen in the short intervals since she had left the room. There are no police officers stationed in the village. There is not so much as a municipal watchman, for there is no municipality. There never was such a place, I believe. Scalea is supposed to look after it in some mysterious way, and it takes a couple of hours to get anybody from there. As the old woman had lived in the village all her life, it did not even occur to her to apply to any civil authority for help. She simply set up a howl and ran through the village in the dark, screaming out that her dead master's house had been robbed. Many of the people looked out, but at first no one seemed inclined to help her. Most of them, judging her by themselves, whispered to each other that she had probably stolen the money herself. The first man to move was the father of the girl whom Angelo was to marry. Having collected his household, all of whom felt a personal interest in the wealth which was to have come into the family, he declared it to be his opinion that the chest had been stolen by the 2 journeyman masons who lodged in the house. He headed a search for them, which naturally began in Alaria's house and ended in the carpenter's workshop, where the thieves were found discussing a measure of wine with the carpenter over the half-finished coffin by the light of one earthen lamp filled with oil and tallow. The search party at once accused the delinquents of the crime and threatened to lock them up in the cellar till the carabineers could be fetched from Scalea. The 2 men looked at each other for one moment, and then, without the slightest hesitation, they put out the single light, seized the unfinished coffin between them, and using it as a sort of battering ram, dashed upon their assailants in the dark. In a few moments, they were beyond pursuit. That is the end of the first part of the story. The treasure had disappeared, and as no trace of it could be found, the people supposed that the thieves had succeeded in carrying it off. The old man was buried, and when Angelo came back at last, he had to borrow money to pay for the miserable funeral, and had some difficulty in doing so. He hardly needed to be told that in losing his inheritance he had lost his bride. In this part of the world, marriages are made on strictly business principles, and if the promised cash is not forthcoming on the appointed day, the bride or the bridegroom whose parents have failed to produce it may as well take themselves off, for there will be no wedding. Poor Angelo knew that well enough. His father had been possessed of hardly any land, and now that the hard cash which he had brought from South America was gone, there was nothing left but debts for the building materials that were to have been used for enlarging and improving the old house. Angelo was beggared, and the nice plump little creature, who was to have been his, turned up her nose at him in the most approved fashion. As for Christina, it was several days before she was missed, for no one remembered that she had been sent to Scalea for the doctor, who had never come. She often disappeared in the same way for days together, when she could find a little work here and there at the distant farms among the hills. But when she did not come back at all, people began to wonder, and at last made up their minds that she had connived with the masons and had escaped with them. I paused and emptied my glass. That sort of thing could not happen anywhere else, observed Holger, filling his everlasting pipe again. It is wonderful what a natural charm there is about murder and sudden death in a romantic country like this. Deeds that would be simply brutal and disgusting anywhere else become dramatic and mysterious because this is Italy, and we are living in a genuine tower of Charles V, built against Barbary pirates. There's something in that, I admitted. Holger is the most romantic man in the world inside of himself, but he always thinks it necessary to explain why he feels anything. I suppose the VA found the poor girl's body with the box, he said presently. As it seems to interest you, I answered, I'll tell you the rest of the story. The mood had risen by this time. The outline of the thing on the mound was clearer to our eyes than before. The village very soon settled down to its small, dull life. No one missed old Alario, who had been away so much on his voyages to South America that he had never been a familiar figure in his native place. Angelo lived in the half-finished house, and because he had no money to pay the old woman's servant, she would not stay with him, but once in a long time she would come and wash a shirt for him, for old acquaintance' sake. Besides the house, he had inherited a small patch of ground at some distance from the village. He tried to cultivate it, but he had no heart in the work, for he knew he could ne'er pay the taxes on it, and on the house, which would certainly be confiscated by the government, or seized for the debt of the building material, which the man who had supplied it refused to take back. Angelo was very unhappy. So long as his father had been alive and rich, every girl in the village had been in love with him. But that was all changed now. It had been pleasant to be admired and courted and invited to drink wine by fathers who had girls to marry. It was hard to be stared at coldly, and sometimes laughed at because he had been robbed of his inheritance. He cooked his miserable meals for himself, and from being sad became melancholy and morose. At twilight, when the day's work was done, instead of hanging about in the open space before the church, with young fellows of his own age, he took to wandering in lonely places on the outskirts of the village till it was quite dark. Then he slunk home and went to bed to save the expense of a light. But in those lonely twilight hours he began to have strange waking dreams. He was not always alone, for often when he sat on the stump of a tree where the narrow path turns down the gorge, he was sure that a woman came up noiselessly over the rough stones, as if her feet were bare, and she stood under a clump of chestnut trees only 6 yards down the path, and beckoned to him without speaking. Though she was in the shadow, he knew that her lips were red, and that, when they parted a little and smiled at him, she showed 2 small, sharp teeth. He knew this at first rather than saw it, and he knew that it was Christina, and that she was dead. Yet he was not afraid. He only wondered whether it was a dream, for he thought that if he had been awake he should have been frightened. Besides, the dead woman had red lips, and that could only happen in a dream. Whenever he went near the gorget after sunset, she was already there waiting for him. Or else she very soon appeared, and he began to be sure of her blood-red mouth. But now each feature grew distinct, and the pale face looked at him with deep and hungry eyes. It was the eyes that grew dim. Little by little he came to know that some day the dream would not end when he turned away to go home, but would lead him down the gorge out of which the vision rose. She was nearer now when she beckoned to him. Her cheeks were not livid like those of the dead, but pale with starvation, with the furious and unappeased physical hunger of her eyes that devoured him. They feasted on his soul and cast a spell over him, and at last they were close to his own and held him. He could not tell whether her breath was as hot as fire or as cold as ice. He could not tell whether her red lips burnt his or froze them, or whether her 5 fingers on his wrists seared scorching scars or bit his flesh like frost. He could not tell whether he was awake or asleep, whether she was alive or dead, but he knew that she loved him, she alone of all creatures, earthly or unearthly, and her spell had power over him. When the moon rose high that night, the shadow of that thing was not alone down there upon the mound. Angelo awoke in the cool dawn, drenched with dew and chilled through flesh and blood and bone. He opened his eyes to the faint grey light and saw the stars were still shining overhead. He was very weak, and his heart was beating so slowly that he was almost like a man fainting. Slowly he turned his head on the mound, as on a pillow, but the other face was not there. Fear seized him suddenly, a fear unspeakable and unknown. He sprang to his feet and fled up the gorge, and he never looked behind him until he reached the door of the house on the outskirts of the village. Drearily he went to his work that day, and wearily the hours dragged themselves after the sun, till at last it touched the sea and sank, and the great sharp hills above Maratea turned purple against the dove-coloured eastern sky. Angelo shouldered his heavy hoe and left the field. He felt less tired now than in the morning when he had begun to work, but he promised himself that he would go home without lingering by the gorge, and eat the best supper he could get himself, and sleep all night in his bed like a Christian man. Not again would he be tempted down the narrow way by a shadow with red lips and icy breath. Not again would he dream that dream of terror and delight. He was near the village now. It was 30 minutes since the sun had set, and the cracked church bell sent little discordant echoes across the rocks and ravines to tell all good people that the day was done. Angelo stood still a moment where the path forked, where it led toward the village on the left, and down to the gorge on the right, where a clump of chestnut trees overhung the narrow way. He stood still a minute, lifting his battered hat from his head and gazing at the fast-fading sea westward, and his lips moved as he silently repeated the familiar evening prayer. His lips moved, but the words that followed them in his brain lost their meaning and turned into others, and ended in a name that he spoke aloud. Christina. With the name, the tension of his will relaxed suddenly. Reality went out and the dream took him again, and bore him on swiftly and surely like a man walking in his sleep, down, down, by the steep path in the gathering darkness. And as she glided beside him, Christina whispered strange, sweet things in his ear, which somehow, if he had been awake, he knew that he could not quite have understood. But now they were the most wonderful words he had ever heard in his life. And she kissed him also, but not upon his mouth. He felt her sharp kisses upon his white throat, and he knew that her lips were red. So the wild dream sped on through twilight and darkness and moonrise, and all the glory of the summer's night. But in the chilly dawn he lay as one half dead upon the mound down there, recalling and not recalling, drained of his blood, yet strangely longing to give those red lips more. Then came the fear, the awful nameless panic, the mortal horror that guards the confines of the world we see not, neither know of as we know of other things, but which we feel when its icy chill freezes our bones and stirs our hair with the touch of a ghostly hand. Once more Angela sprang from the mound and fled up the gorge in the breaking day, but his step was less sure this time, and he panted for breath as he ran. And when he came to the bright spring of water that rises halfway up the hillside, he dropped upon his knees and hands and plunged his whole face in and drank as he had never drunk before. For it was the thirst of the wounded man who has lain bleeding all night upon the battlefield. She had him fast now, and he could not escape her, but would come to her every evening at dusk until she had drained him of his last drop of blood. It was in vain that when the day was done he tried to take another turning and to go home by a path that did not lead near the gorge. It was in vain that he made promises to himself each morning at dawn when he climbed the lonely way up from the shore to the village. It was all in vain, for when the sun sank burning into the sea, and the coolness of the evening stole out as from a hiding place to delight the weary world, his feet turned toward the old way, and she was waiting for him in the shadow under the chestnut trees. And then all happened as before, and she fell to kissing his white throat, even as she flitted lightly down the way, winding one arm about him. And as his blood failed, she grew more hungry and more thirsty every day. And every day when he awoke in the early dawn, it was harder to rouse himself to the effort of climbing the steep path to the village. And when he went to his work, his feet dragged painfully, and there was hardly strength in his arms to wield the heavy hoe. He scarcely spoke to anyone now, but the people said he was consuming himself for love of the girl he was to have married when he lost his inheritance. And they laughed heartily at the thought, for this is not a very romantic country. At this time Antonio, the man who stays here to look after the tower, returned from a visit to his people, who lived near Salerno. He had been away all the time since before Olario's death, and knew nothing of what had happened. He has told me that he came back late in the afternoon and shut himself up in the tower to eat and sleep, for he was very tired. It was past midnight when he awoke, and when he looked out toward the mound, and he saw something, and he did not sleep again that night. When he went out again in the morning, it was broad daylight, and there was nothing to be seen on the mound but loose stones and driven sand. Yet he did not go very near it. He went straight up the path to the village, and directly to the house of the old priest. "I have seen an evil thing this night," he said. "I have seen how the dead drink the blood of the living, and the blood is the life." "Tell me what you have seen," said the priest in reply. Antonio told him everything he had seen. "You must bring your book and your holy water tonight," he added. "I will be here before sunset to go down with you, and if it pleases your reverence to sup with me while we wait, I will make ready." "I will come," the priest answered, "for I have read in old books of these strange beings, which are neither quick nor dead, and which lie ever fresh in their graves, stealing out in the dusk to taste life and blood." Antonio cannot read, but he was glad to see that the priest understood the business, for, of course, the books must have been instructed him as to the best means of quieting the half-living thing forever. So Antonio went away to his work, which consists largely in sitting on the shady side of the tower when he is not perched upon a rock with a fishing rig, catching nothing. But on that day he went twice to look at the mound in the bright sunlight, and he searched round and round it for some hole through which the being might get in and out, but he found none. When the sun began to sink and the air was cooler in the shadows, he went up to fetch the old priest, carrying a little wicker basket with him, and in this they placed a bottle of holy water, and the basin, and sprinkler, and the stole which the priest would need, and they came down and waited in the door of the tower till it should be dark. But while the light still lingered, very grey and faint, they saw something moving just there, 2 figures, a man's that walked, and a woman's that flitted beside him, and while her head lay on his shoulder, she kissed his throat. The priest has told me that too, and that his teeth chattered, and he grasped Antonio's arm. The vision passed and disappeared into the shadow. Then Antonio got the leathern flask of strong liquor, which he kept for great occasions, and poured such a draught as made the old man feel almost young again, and gave the priest his stole to put on, and the holy water to carry, and they went out together toward the spot where the work was to be done. Antonio says that in spite of the rum, his own knees shook together, and the priest stumbled over his Latin. For when they were yet a few yards from the mound, the flickering light of the lantern fell upon Angelo's white face, unconscious as if in sleep, and on his upturned throat, over which a very thin red line of blood trickled down into his collar, and the flickering light of the lantern played upon another face that looked up from the feast, upon 2 deep, dead eyes that saw, in spite of death, upon parted lips redder than life itself, upon two gleaming teeth on which glistened a rosy drop. Then the priest, good old man, shut his eyes tight and showered holy water before him, and his cracked voice rose almost to a scream. And then Antonio, who is no coward after all, raised his pick in one hand and the lantern in the other, as he sprang forward, not knowing what the end should be. And then he swears that he heard a woman's cry, and the thing was gone, and Angelo lay alone on the mound unconscious, with the red line on his throat and the beads of deathly sweat on his cold forehead. They lifted him, half dead as he was, and laid him on the ground close by. Then Antonio went to work, and the priest helped him, thought he was old and could not do much, and they dug deep, and at last Antonio, standing in the grave, stooped down with his lantern to see what he might see. His hair used to be dark brown, with grizzled streaks about the temples. In less than a month from that day he was as grey as a badger. He was a miner when he was young, and most of these fellows have seen ugly sights now and then, when accidents have happened, but he had never seen what he saw that night. That thing which is neither alive nor dead. That thing that will abide neither above ground nor in the grave. Antonio had brought something with him which the priest had not noticed, a sharp stake shaped from a piece of tough old driftwood. He had it with him now, and he had his heavy pick, and he had taken the lantern down into the grave. I don't think any power on earth could make him speak of what happened then, and the old priest was too frightened to look in. He says he heard Antonio breathing like a wild beast, and moving as if he were fighting with something almost as strong as himself. And he heard an evil sound also, with blows, as of something violently driven through flesh and bone. And then, the most awful sound of all, a woman's shriek, the unearthly scream of a woman neither dead nor alive, but buried deep for many days. And he, the poor old priest, could only rock himself as he knelt there in the sand, crying aloud his prayers and exorcisms, to drown these dreadful sounds. Then suddenly a small iron-bound chest was thrown up and rolled over against the old man's knee, and in a moment more Antonio was beside him, his face as white as tallow in the flickering light of the lantern, shoveling the sand and pebbles into the grave with furious haste, and looking over the edge till the pit was half full, and the priest said that there was much fresh blood on Antonio's hands and on his clothes. I had come to the end of my story. Holger finished his wine and leaned back in his chair. Sir Angelo got his own again, he said. Did he marry the prim and plump young person to whom he had been betrothed? No, he has been badly frightened. He went to South America and has not been heard of since. And that poor thing's body is there still, I suppose, said Holger. Is it quite dead yet, I wonder? I wonder too, but whether it be dead or alive, I should hardly care to see it, even in broad daylight. Antonio is as grey as a badger, and he has never been quite the same man since that night. Past the sleeping city the river sweeps. Along its left bank the old canal creeps. I did not intend that to be poetry, although the scene is poetic. Somberly, gruesomely poetic, like the poems of Poe. Too well I know, it too often have I walked over the grass-grown path beside the reflections of black trees and tumble-down shacks and distant factory chimneys in the sluggish waters that move so slowly and cease to move at all. I shall be called mad, and I shall be a suicide. I shall take no pains to cover up my trail or to hide the thing that I shall do. What will it matter afterward, what they say of me? If they knew the truth, if they could vision even dimly the beings with whom I have consorted, if the faintest realization might be theirs of the thing I am becoming, and of the fate from which I am saving their city, then they would call me a great hero. But it does not matter what they call me, as I have said before. Let me write down the things I am about to write down, and let them be taken, as they will be taken, for the last ravings of a madman. The city will be in mourning for the thing I shall have done, but its mourning will be of no consequence beside that other fate from which I shall have saved it. I have always had a taste for nocturnal prowling. We as a race have grown too intelligent to take seriously any of the old instinctive fears that preserved us through preceding generations. Our sole remaining salvation, then, has come to be our tendency to travel in herds. We wander at night, but our objective is somewhere on the brightly lighted streets, or still somewhere where men do not go alone. When we travel far afield, it is in company. Few of my acquaintance, few in the whole city here, would care to ramble at midnight over the grass-grown path I have spoken of, not because they would fear to do so, but because such things are not being done. Well, it is dangerous to differ individually from one's fellows. It is dangerous to wander from the beaten road. And the fears that guarded the race in the dawn of time and through the centuries were real fears, founded on reality. A month ago, I was a stranger here. I had just taken my first position. I was graduated from college only 3 months before, in the spring. I was lonely, and likely to remain so for some time, for I have always been of a solitary nature, making friends slowly. I had received one invitation out, to visit the camp of a fellow employee in the firm for which I worked, a camp which was located on the farther side of the wide river, the side across from the city and the canal, where the bank was high and steep and heavily wooded, and little tents blossomed all along the water's edge. At night these camps were a string of sparkling lights and tiny leaping campfires, and the tinkle of music carried faintly far across the calmly flowing water. That far bank of the river was no place for an eccentric, solitary man to love. But the near bank, which would have been an eyesore to the campers, had not the river been so wide, the near bank attracted me from my first glimpse of it. We embarked in a motorboat at some distance downstream and swept up along the near bank, and then out and across the current. I turned my eyes backward. The murk of stagnant water that was the canal, the jumble of low buildings beyond it, the lonely, low-lying waste of the narrow strip of land between canal and river, the dark, scattered trees growing there. I intended to see more of these things. That weekend bored me, but I repaid myself no later than Monday evening, the first evening when I was back in the city, alone and free. I ate a solitary dinner immediately after leaving the office. I went to my room and slept from 7 until nearly midnight. I wakened naturally then, for my whole heart was set on exploring the alluring solitude I had discovered. I dressed, slipped out of the house and into the street, started the motor in my roadster which I had left parked at the curb, and drove through the lighted streets. I left behind that part of town which was thick with vehicles carrying people home from their evening engagements, and began to thread my way through darker and narrower streets. Once I had to back out of a cul-de-sac, and once I had to detour around a closed block. This part of town was not alluring, even to me. It was dismal without being solitary. But when I had parked my car on a rough, cobbled street that ran directly down into the inky waters of the canal and crossed a narrow bridge, I was repaid. A few minutes set my feet on the old towpath where mules had drawn river boats up and down only a year or so ago. Across the canal now, as I walked upstream at a swinging pace, the miserable shacks where miserable people lived seemed to march with me, and then fell behind. They looked like places in which murders might be committed, every one of them. The bridge I had crossed was near the end of the city going north, as the canal marked its western extremity. 10 minutes of walking and the dismal shacks were quite a distance behind. The river was farther away, and the strip of wasteland much wider and more wooded, and tall trees across the canal marched with me as the evil-looking houses had done before. Far and faint, the sound of a bell in the city reached my ears. It was midnight. I stopped, enjoyed the desolation around me. It had the savour I had expected and hoped for. I stood for some time looking up at the sky, watching the low drift of heavy clouds, which were visible in the dull reflected glow from distant lights in the heart of the city, so that they appeared to have a lurid phosphorescence of their own. The ground under my feet, on the contrary, was utterly devoid of light. I had felt my way carefully, knowing the edge of the canal partly by instinct, partly by the even more perfect blackness of the water in it, and even holding pretty well to the path, because it was perceptibly sunken below the ground beside it. Now, as I stood motionless in this spot, my eyes upcast, my mind adrift with strange fancies, suddenly my feelings of satisfaction and well-being gave way to something different. Fear was an emotion unknown to me, for those things which make men fear I had always loved. A graveyard at night was to me a charming place for a stroll and meditation. But now the roots of my hair seemed to move upright on my head, and along all the length of my spine I was conscious of a prickling, tingling sensation, such as my forefathers may have felt in the jungle when the hair on their backs stood up as the hair of my head was doing now. Also, I was afraid to move, and I knew that there were eyes upon me, and that was why I was afraid to move. I was afraid of those eyes, afraid to see them. All this while I stood perfectly still, my face up-tilted toward the sky. But after a terrible mental effort I mastered myself. Slowly, with an attempt to propitiate the owner of the unseen eyes by my casual manner, I lowered my own. I looked straight ahead, at the softly swaying silhouette of the treetops across the canal as they moved gently in the cool night wind, at the mass of blackness that was those trees and the opposite shore, at the shiny blackness where the reflections of the clouds glinted vaguely and disappeared. That was the canal. And again I raised my eyes a little, for just across the canal, where the shadows massed most heavily, there was that at which I must look more closely. And now, as I grew accustomed to the greater blackness, and my pupils expanded, I dimly discerned the contours of an old boat or barge, half sunken in the water, an old abandoned canal boat. But was I dreaming, or was there a white-clad figure seated on the roof of the low cabin aft, a pale, heart-shaped face gleaming strangely at me from the darkness, the glow of two eyes seeming to light up the face and to detach it from the darkness? Surely there could be no doubt as to the eyes. They shone as the eyes of animals shine in the dark, with a phosphorescent gleam and a glimmer of red. Well, I had heard that some human eyes have that quality at night. But what a place for a human being to be. A girl, too, I was sure. That daintily heart-shaped face was the face of a girl, surely. I was seeing it clearer and clearer, either because my eyes were growing more accustomed to peering into the deeper shadows, or because of that phosphorescence in the eyes that stared back at me. I raised my voice softly, not to break her too much the stillness of the night. "Hello, who's there? Are you lost or marooned, and can I help?" There was a little pause. I was conscious of a soft lapping at my feet. A stronger night wind had sprung up, was ruffling the dark waters. I had been over-warm, and where it struck me, the perspiration turned cold on my body, so that I shivered uncontrollably. "You can stay, and talk a while if you will. I am lonely, but not lost. I live here." I could hardly believe my ears. The voice was little more than a whisper, but it had carried clearly, a girl's voice sure enough, and she lived there, in an old abandoned canal boat, half submerged in the stagnant water. "You are not alone there." "No, not alone. My father lives here with me, but he is deaf, and he sleeps soundly." Did the night wind blow still colder, as though it came to us from some unseen, frozen sea? Or was there something in her tone that chilled me, even as a strange attraction drew me toward her? I wanted to draw near to her, to see closely the pale, heart-shaped face, to lose myself in the bright eyes that I had seen shining in the darkness. I wanted to hold her in my arms, to find her mouth with mine, to kiss it. With a start I realized the nature of my thoughts, and for an instant lost all thought in surprise. Never in my 22 years had I felt love before. My fancies had been otherwise directed. A moss-grown, fallen gravestone was a dearer thing to me to contemplate than the fairest face in all the world. Yet, surely, what I felt now was love. I took a reckless step nearer the edge of the bank. "Could I come over to you?" I begged. "It's warm, and I don't mind a wetting. It's late, I know, but I would give a great deal to sit beside you and talk, if only for a few minutes before I go back to town. It's a lonely place here for a girl like you to live. Your father should not mind if you exchange a few words with someone occasionally." Was it the unconventionality of my request that made her next words sound like a long-drawn shudder of protest? There was a strangeness in the tones of her voice that held me wondering every time she spoke. "No, no. Oh, no, you must not swim across. Then, could I come tomorrow, or some day soon, in the daytime? And would you let me come on board then? Or would you come on shore and talk to me, perhaps?" "Not in the daytime. Never in the daytime." Again, the intensity of her low-tone negation held me spellbound. It was not her sense of the impropriety of the hour, then, that had dictated her manner, for surely any girl with the slightest sense of the fitness of things would rather have a tryst by daytime than after midnight. Yet there was an inference in her last words that if I came again, it should be again at night. Still feeling the spell that had enthralled me, as one does not forget the presence of a drug in the air that is stealing one's senses, even when those senses begin to wander and to busy themselves with other things, I yet spoke shortly. "Why do you say never in the daytime? Do you mean that I may come more than this once at night, though now you won't let me cross the canal to you at the expense of my own clothes, and you won't put down your plank or drawbridge, or whatever you come on shore with, and talk to me here for only a moment? I'll come again if you'll let me talk to you instead of calling across the water. I'll come again any time you will let me, day or night. I don't care. I want to come to you, but I only ask you to explain. If I came in the daytime and met your father, wouldn't that be the best thing to do? Then we could be really acquainted. We could be friends. In the night-time, my father sleeps. In the daytime, I sleep. How could I talk to you or introduce you to my father then? If you came on board this boat in the daytime, you would find my father, and you would be sorry. As for me, I would be sleeping. I could never introduce you to my father, do you see? You sleep soundly, you and your father." Again there was pique in my voice. "Yes, we sleep soundly, and always at different times." "Always at different times. We are on guard. One of us is always on guard. We have been hardly used down there in your city, and we have taken refuge here. And we are always on guard." The resentment vanished from my breast, and I felt my heart go out to her anew. She was so pale, so pitiful in the night. My eyes were learning better and better how to pierce the darkness. They were giving me a more definite picture of my companion, if I could think of her as a companion, between myself and whom stretched the black water. The sadness of the lonely scene, the perfection of the solitude itself, these things contributed to her pitifulness. Then there was that strangeness of atmosphere of which, even yet, I had only partly taken note. There was the strange, shivering chill, which yet did not seem like the healthful chill of a cool evening. In fact, it did not prevent me from feeling the oppression of the night, which was unusually sultry. It was like a little breath of deadly cold that came and went, and yet did not alter the temperature of the air itself, as the small ripples on the surface of water do not concern the water even a foot down. And even that was not all. There was an unwholesome smell about the night, a dank, mouldy smell that might have been the very breath of death and decay. Even I, the connoisseur in all things dismal and unwholesome, tried to keep my mind from dwelling overmuch upon that smell. What it must be to live breathing it constantly in, I could not think. But no doubt the girl and her father were used to it, and no doubt it came from the stagnant water of the canal, and from the rotting wood of the old, half-sunken boat that was their refuge. My heart throbbed with pity again. Their refuge, what a place! And my clearer vision of the girl showed me that she was pitifully thin, even though possessed of the strange face that drew me to her. Her clothes hung around her like old rags, but hers was no scarecrow aspect. Although little flesh clothed her bones, her very bones were beautiful. I was sure the little, pale, heart-shaped face would be more beautiful still, if I could only see it closely. I must see it closely. I must establish some claim to consideration as a friend of the strange, lonely crew of the half-sunken wreck. "This is a poor place to call a refuge," I said finally. "One might have very little money and yet do somewhat better. Perhaps I might help you. I am sure I could, if your ill treatment in the city was because of poverty. I am not rich, but I could help that. I could help you a little with money if you would let me, or in any case, I could find a position for you. I'm sure I could do that." The eyes that shone fitfully toward me like two small pools of water, intermittently lit by a cloud-swept sky, seemed to glow more brightly. She had been half crouching, half sitting on top of the cabin. Now she leapt to her feet with one quick, sinuous, abrupt motion, and took a few rapid, restless steps to and fro before she answered. When she spoke, her voice was little more than a whisper, yet surely rage was in its shrill sibilance. "Fool! Do you think you would be helping me, to tie me to a desk, to shut me behind doors, away from freedom, away from the delight of doing my own will, of seeking my own way? Never, never would I let you do that. Rather this old boat, rather a deserted grave under the stars, for my home. A boundless surprise swept over me, and a positive feeling of kinship with this strange being, whose face I had hardly seen, possessed me. So I myself might have spoken, so I had often felt, though I had never dreamed of putting my thoughts so definitely, so forcibly. My regularized daytime life was a thing I thought little of. I really lived only in my nocturnal prowlings. Why, this girl was right. All of life should be free, and spent in places that interested and attracted. How little I knew that night, that dread forces were tugging at my soul, were finding entrance to it, and easy access through the morbid weakness of my nature. How little I knew at what a cost I deviated so radically from my kind, who herd in cities and love well-lit ways and the sight of man, and sweet and wholesome places to be solitary in, when the desire for solitude comes over them. That night it seemed to me that there was but one important thing in life, to allay the angry passion my unfortunate words had aroused in the breast of my beloved, and to win from her some answering feeling. "I understand, much better than you think," I whispered tremulously. "What I want is to see you again, to come to know you, and to serve you in any way that I may. Surely there must be something in which I can be of use to you. All you have to do from tonight on forever is to command me. I swear it." "You do swear it?" Delighted at the eagerness of her words, I lifted my hand toward the dark heavens. "I swear it. From this night on forever, I swear it." "Then listen. Tonight you may not come to me, nor I to you. I do not want you to board this boat, not tonight, not any night, and most of all not any day. But do not look so sad. I will come to you. No, not tonight, perhaps not for many nights, yet before very long. I will come to you there on the bank of the canal, when the water in the canal ceases to flow." I must have made a gesture of impatience or of despair. It sounded like a way of saying never, for why should the water in the canal cease to flow? She read my thoughts in some way, for she answered them. "You do not understand. I am speaking seriously. I am promising to meet you there on the bank, and soon. For the water within these banks is moving slower, always slower. Higher up, I have heard that the canal has been drained. Between these lower locks, the water still seeps in and drops slowly, slowly downstream. But there will come a night when it will be quite stagnant. And on that night I will come to you, and when I come I will ask of you a favor, and you will keep your oath." It was all the assurance I could get that night. She had come back to the side of the cabin where she had sat crouched before, and she resumed again that posture and sat still and silent, watching me. Sometimes I could see her eyes upon me, and sometimes not, but I felt that their gaze was unwavering. The little cold breeze which I had finally forgotten while I was talking with her was blowing again, and the unwholesome smell of decay grew heavier before the dawn. She would not speak again, nor answer me when I spoke to her, and I grew nervous and strangely ill at ease. At last I went away, and in the first faint light of dawn I slipped up the stairs of my rooming house and into my own room. I was deadly tired at the office next day, and day after day slipped away, and I grew more and more weary. For a man cannot wake day and night without suffering, especially in hot weather, and that was what I was doing. I haunted the old towpath and waited, night after night, on the bank opposite the sunken boat. Sometimes I saw my lady of the darkness, and sometimes not. When I saw her she spoke little, but sometimes she sat there on the top of the cabin and let me watch her till the dawn, or until the strange uneasiness that was like fright drove me from her and back to my room, where I tossed restlessly in the heat and dreamed strange dreams, half waking till the sun shone in on my forehead and I tumbled into my clothes and down to the office again. Once I asked her why she had made the fanciful condition that she would not come ashore to meet me until the waters of the canal had ceased to run. How eagerly I studied those waters! How I stole away at noontime more than once, not to approach the old boat, but to watch the almost imperceptible downward drift of bubbles, bits of straw, twigs, rubbish, My questioning displeased her, and I asked her that no more. It was enough that she chose to be whimsical. My part was to wait. It was more than a week later that I questioned her again, this time on a different subject, and after that, I curbed my curiosity relentlessly. Never speak to me of things you do not understand about me. Never again, or I will not show myself to you again. And when I walk on the path yonder, it will not be with you. I had asked her what form of persecution she and her father had suffered in the city that had driven them out to this lonely place, and where in the city they had lived. Frightened seriously lest I lose the ground I was sure I had gained with her, I was about to speak of something else. But before I could find the words, her low voice came to me again. It was horrible, horrible, those little houses below the bridge, those houses along the canal. Tell me, are they not worse than my boat? Life there was shut in and furtive. I was not free as I am now, and the freedom I will soon have will make me forget the things I have not yet forgotten. The screaming, the reviling and cursing, fear and flight. As you pass back by those houses, think how you would like to be shut in one of them, and in fear of your life, and then think of them no more, for I would forget them, and I will never speak of them again. I dared not answer her. I was surprised that she had vouchsafed me so much. But surely her words meant this, that before she had come to live on the decaying, water-rotted old boat, she had lived in one of those horrible houses I passed by on my way to her. Those houses, each of which looked like the predestined scene of a murder. As I left her that night, I felt that I was very daring. 1 or 2 nights more, and you will walk beside me, I called to her. I have watched the water at noon, and it hardly moves at all. I threw a scrap of paper into the canal, and it whirled and swung a little, where a thin skim of oil lay on the water down there. Oil from the big dirty city you are well out of. But though I watched and watched, I could not see it move downward at all. Perhaps tomorrow night, or the night after, you will walk on the bank with me. I hope it will be clear and moonlight, and I will be near enough to see you clearly, as well as you seem always to see me in darkness or moonlight, equally well, and perhaps I will kiss you, but not unless you let me. And yet the next day, for the first time my thoughts were definitely troubled. I had been living in a dream. I began to speculate concerning the end of the path on which my feet were set. I had conceived from the first such a horror of those old houses by the canal. They were well enough to walk past, nursing gruesome thoughts for a midnight treat. But, much as I loved all that was weird and eerie about the girl I was wooing so strangely, it was a little too much for my fancy that she had come from them. By this time I had become decidedly unpopular in my place of business. Not that I had made enemies, but that my peculiar ways had caused too much adverse comment. It would have taken very little, I think, to have made the entire office force decide that I was mad. After the events of the next 24 hours, and after this letter is found and read, they will be sure that they knew it all along. At this time, however, they were punctiliously polite to me, and merely let me alone as much as possible, which suited me perfectly. I dragged wearily through day after day, exhausted for lack of sleep, conscious of their speculative glances, living only for the night to come. But on this day I approached the man who had invited me to the camp across the river, who had unknowingly shown me the way that led to my love. "Have you ever noticed the row of tumble-down houses along the canal on the city side?" I asked him. He gave me an odd look. I suppose he sensed the significance of my breaking silence after so long to speak of them, sensed that in some way I had a deep interest in them. "You have odd tastes, Morton," he said after a moment. "I suppose you wander into strange places sometimes. I've heard you speak of an enthusiasm for graveyards at night, but my advice to you is to keep away from those houses. They're unsavory, and their reputation is unsavory. Positively, I think you'd be in danger of your life if you go poking around there. They have been the scene of several murders, and a dope den or two has been cleaned out of them. Why in the world you should want to investigate them?" "I don't expect to investigate them," I said testily. "I was merely interested in them from the outside. To tell you the truth, I'd heard a story, a rumor, never mind where. But you say there have been murders there. I suppose this rumor I heard may have had to do with an attempted one. There was a girl who lived there with her father once, and they were set upon there, or something of the sort, and had to run away. Did you ever hear that story?" Barrett gave me an odd look, such as one gives in speaking of a past horror so dreadful that the mere speaking of it makes it live terribly again. "What you say reminds me of a horrible thing that was said to have happened down there once," he said. "It was in all the papers. A little child disappeared in one of those houses, and a couple of poor lodgers who lived there, a girl and her father, were accused of having made away with it. They were accused. Oh, well, I don't like to talk about such things. It was too dreadful. The child's body was found. Part of it was found. It was mutilated, and the people in the house seemed to believe it had been mutilated in order to conceal the manner of its death. There was an ugly wound in the throat, it finally came out, and it seemed as if the child might have been bled to death. It was found in the girl's room, hidden away. The old man and his daughter escaped before the police were called. The countryside was scoured for them. The whole country was scoured, but they were never found." "Why, you must have read it in the papers. It was several years ago." I nodded with a heavy heart. I had read it in the papers, I remembered now, and again a terrible questioning came over me. Who was this girl? What was this girl who seemed to have my heart in her keeping? Why did not a merciful God let me die then? Befogged with exhaustion, bemused in a dire enchantment, my mind was incapable of thought, and yet some soul, process akin to that which saves the sleepwalker poised at perilous heights, sounded its warning now. My mind was filled with doleful images. There were women, I had heard and read, who slew to satisfy a bloodlust. There were ghosts, spectres, call them what you will, their names have been legion in the dark pages of that lore which dates back to the infancy of the races of the earth, who retained even in death this bloodlust. Vampires, they had been called that, I had read of them. Corpses by day, spirits of evil by night, roaming abroad in their own forms or in the forms of bats or unclean beasts, killing body and soul of their victims. For whoever dies of the repeated kiss of the vampire, which leaves its mark on the throat and draws the blood from the body, becomes a vampire also. Of such beings I had read. And, horror of horrors, in that last cursed day at the office, I remembered reading of these vampires, these undead, that in their nocturnal flights they had one limitation: they could not cross running water. That night I went my usual nightly way with tears of weakness on my face, for my weakness was supreme, and I recognized fully at last the misery of being the victim of an enchantment stronger than my feeble will. But I went. I approached the neighborhood of the canal boat as the distant city clock chimed the first stroke of 12. It was the dark of the moon, and the sky was overcast. Heat lightning flickered low in the sky, seeming to come from every point of the compass and circumscribe the horizon, as if unseen fires burned behind the rim of the world. By its fitful glimmer I saw a new thing. Between the old boat and the canal bank stretched a long, slim, solid-looking shadow. A plank had been let down. In that moment I realized that I had been playing with powers of evil which had no intent now to let me go, which were indeed about to lay hold upon me with an inexorable grasp. Why had I come tonight? Why but that the spell of the enchantment laid upon me was a thing more potent and far more unbreakable than any wholesome spell of love? The creature I sought out. Oh, I remembered now, with the cold perspiration beading my brow, the lore hidden away between the covers of the dark old book which I had read so many years ago and half forgotten, until dim memories of it stirred within me, this last day and night. My lady of the night. No woman of wholesome flesh and blood and odd perverted tastes that matched my own, but one of the undead. In that moment I knew it, and knew that the vampires of old legends polluted still, in these latter days, the fair surface of the earth. And on the instant, behind me in the darkness, there was the crackle of a twig, and something brushed against my arm. This, then, was the fulfillment of my dream. I knew, without turning my head, that the pale, dainty face with its glowing eyes was near my own, that I had only to stretch out my arm to touch the slender grace of the girl I had so longed to draw near. I knew, and should have felt the rapture I had anticipated. Instead, the roots of my hair prickled coldly. unendurably, as they had on the night when I had first sighted the old boat. The miasmic odours of the night, heavy and oppressive with heat and unrelieved by a breath of air, all but overcame me, and I fought with myself to prevent my teeth clicking in my head. The little waves of coldness I had felt often in this spot were chasing over my body. Yet they were not from any breeze. The leaves on the trees hung down motionless, as though they were actually wilting on their branches. With an effort, I turned my head. 2 hands caught me around my neck. The pale face was so near that I felt the warm breath from its nostrils fanning my cheek. And suddenly all that was wholesome in my perverted nature rose uppermost. I longed for the touch of the red mouth, like a dark flower opening before me in the night. I longed for it, and yet more I dreaded it. I shrank back, catching in a powerful grip the fragile wrists of the hands that strove to hold me. I must not yield to the faintness that I felt stealing languorously over me. I was facing down the path toward the city. A low rumble of thunder, the first, broke the torrid hush of the summer night. A glare of lightning seemed to tear the night asunder, to light up the whole universe. Overhead, the clouds were careening madly in fantastic shapes, driven by a wind that swept the upper heavens without, as yet causing even a trembling in the air lower down. And far down the canal that baleful glare seemed to play around and hover over the little row of shanties, murder-cursed and haunted by the ghost of a dead child. My gaze was fixed on them while I held away from me the pallid face and fought off the embrace that sought to overcome my resisting will. And so a long moment passed. The glare faded out of the sky, and a greater darkness took the world. But there was a near, more menacing glare fastened upon my face, the glare of 2 eyes that watched mine, that had watched me as I, unthinking, stared down at the dark houses. This girl, this woman who had come to me at my own importunate requests, did not love me, since I had shrunk from her. She did not love me, but it was not only that. She had watched me as I gazed down at the houses that held her dark past, and I was sure that she divined my thoughts. She knew my horror of those houses. She knew my newborn horror of her, and she hated me for it, hated me more malignantly than I had believed a human being could hate. And at that point in my thoughts, I felt my skin prickle and my scalp rise again. Could a human being cherish such hatred as I read, trembling more and more, in those glowing fires, lit with what seemed to me more like the fires of hell than any light that ought to shine in a woman's eyes? And through all this, not a word had passed between us. So far I have written calmly. I wish that I could write on so to the end. If I could do that, there might be 1 or 2 of those who will regard this as the document of a maniac, who would believe the horrors of which I am about to write. But I am only flesh and blood. At this point in the happenings of the awful night, my calmness deserted me. At this point I felt that I had been drawn into the midst of a horrible nightmare from which there was no escape, no waking. As I write, this feeling again overwhelms me, until I can hardly write at all, until, were it not for the thing which I must do, I would rush out into the street and run screaming until I was caught and dragged away, to be put behind strong iron bars. Perhaps I would feel safe there. Perhaps. I know that, terrified at the hate I saw confronting me in those redly gleaming eyes, I would have slunk away. The 2 thin hands that caught my arm again were strong enough to prevent that, however. I had been spared her kiss. I was not to escape from the oath I had taken to serve her. You promised, you swore, she hissed in my ear, and tonight you are to keep your oath. I felt my senses reel. My oath. Yes, I had an oath to keep. I had lifted my hand toward the dark heavens and sworn to serve her in any way she chose. Freely, and of my own volition, I had sworn. I sought to evade her. Let me help you back to your boat, I begged. You have no kindly feeling for me, and you have seen it. I love you no longer. I will go back to the city. You can go back to your father and forget that I broke your peace. The laughter that greeted my speech I shall never forget. Not in the depths under the scummy surface of the canal, not in the empty places between the worlds, where my tortured soul may wander. So you do not love me, and I hate you. Fool! Have I waited these weary months for the water to stop, only to go back now? After my father and I returned here and found the old boat rotting in the drained canal, and took refuge in it, when the water was turned into the canal while I slept, so that I could never escape until its flow should cease, because of the thing that I am, even then I dreamed of tonight, when the imprisonment we still shared ceased to matter to my father. Come on board the deserted boat tomorrow, and see why, if you dare. Still I dreamed on of tonight. I have been lonely, desolate, starving. Now the whole world shall be mine, and by your help. I asked her, somehow, what she wanted of me, and a madness overcame me so that I hardly heard her reply. Yet somehow I knew that there was that on the opposite shore of the great river where the pleasure camps were, that she wanted to find. In the madness of my terror, she made me understand and obey her. I must carry her in my arms across the long bridge over the river, deserted in the small hours of the night. The way back to the city was long tonight, long. She walked behind me, and I turned my eyes neither to right nor left. Only as I passed the tumble-down houses, I saw their reflection in the canal, and trembled so that I could have fallen to the ground at the thoughts of the little child this woman had been accused of slaying there, and at the certainty I felt that she was reading my thoughts. And now the horror that engulfed me darkened my brain. I know that we set our feet upon the long, wide bridge that spanned the river. I know the storm broke there, so that I battled for my footing, almost for my life, it seemed, against the pelting deluge. And the horror I had invoked was in my arms, clinging to me, burying its head upon my shoulder. So increasingly dreadful had my pale-faced companion become to me, that I hardly thought of her now as a woman at all, only as a demon of the night. The tempest raged still, as she leapt down out of my arms on the other shore. And again I walked with her against my will, while the trees lashed their branches madly around me, showing the pale undersides of their leaves in the vivid, frequent flashes that rent the heavens. On and on we went, branches flying through the air and missing us by a miracle of ill fortune, such as she and I are, not slain by falling branches. The river was a welter of whitecaps, flattened down into strange shapes by the pounding rain. The clouds, as we glimpsed them, were like devils flying through the sky. Past dark tent after dark tent we stole, and past a few where lights burned dimly behind their canvas walls, and at last we came to an old quarry. Into its artificial ravine she led me, and up to a crevice in the rock wall. "Reach in your hand and pull out the loose stone you will feel," she whispered. "It closes an opening that leads into deep caverns. A human hand must remove that stone. Your hand must move it." Why did I struggle so to disobey her? Why did I fail? It was as though I knew, but my failure was foreordained. I had taken oaths. If you who read have believed that I have set down the truth thus far, the little that is left you will call the ravings of a madman, overtaken by his madness. Yet these things happened. I stretched out my arm, driven by a compulsion I could not resist. At arm's length in the niche in the rock, I felt something move. The loose rock, a long, narrow fragment, much larger than I had expected. Yet it moved easily, seeming to swing on a natural pivot. Outward it swung, toppling toward me. A moment more, and there was a swift rush of the ponderous weight I had loosened. I leaped aside and went down, my forehead grazed by the rock. For a brief moment I must have been unconscious, but only for a moment. My head a stabbing agony of pain, unreal lights flashing before my eyes. I yet knew the reality of the storm that beat me down as I struggled to my feet. I knew the reality of the dark, loathsome shapes that passed me in the dark, crawling out of the office in the rock and flapping through the wild night, along the way that led to the pleasure camps. So, the caverns I had laid open to the outer world were infested with bats. I had been inside unlit caverns, and had heard there the squeaking of the things, felt and heard the flapping of their wings. But never in all my life before had I seen bats as large as men and women. Sick and dizzy from the blow on my head, and from disgust, I crept along the way they were going. If I touched one of them, I felt that I should die of horror. Now at last the storm abated, and a heavy darkness made the whole world seem like the inside of a tomb. Where the tent stood in a long row, the number of the monster bats seemed to diminish. It was as though, horrible thought, they were creeping into the tents with their slumbering occupants. At last I came to a lighted tent and paused, crouching so that the dim radiance that shone through the canvas did not touch me in the shadows. And there I waited, but not for long. There was a dark form silhouetted against the tent, a movement of the flap off the tent, a rustle and confusion, and the dark thing was again in silhouette, but with a difference in the quality of the shadow. The dark thing was inside the tent now, its bat wings extending across the entrance through which it had crept. Fear held me spellbound, and as I looked the shadow changed again, imperceptibly, so that I could not have told how it changed. But now it was not the shadow of a bat, but of a woman. The storm! The storm! I am lost, exhausted. I crept in here to beg for refuge until the dawn. That low, thrilling, sibilant voice. Too well I knew it. Within the tent I heard a murmur of acquiescent voices. At last, I began to understand. I knew the nature of the woman I had carried over the river in my arms, the woman who would not even cross the canal until the water should have ceased utterly to flow. I remembered books I had read, Dracula, other books and stories. I knew they were true books and stories now. I knew those horrors existed for me. I had indeed kept my oath to the creature of darkness. I had brought her to her kind, under her guidance. I had let them loose in hordes upon the pleasure camps. The campers were doomed, and through them others. I forgot my fear. I rushed from my hiding place up to the tent door, and there I screamed and called aloud. Don't take her in. Don't let her stay, nor the others that have crept into the other tents. Wake all the campers. They will sleep on to their destruction. Drive out the interlopers. Drive them out quickly. They are not human. No, and they are not bats. Do you hear me? Do you understand? I was fairly howling in a voice that was strange to me. She is a vampire! They are all vampires! Vampires! Inside the tent I heard a new voice. What can be the matter with that poor man? The voice said. It was a woman's, and gentle. Crazy! Somebody out of his senses, dear, a man's voice answered. Don't be frightened. And then the voice I knew so well. So well. I saw a falling rock strike a man on the head in the storm. He staggered away, but I suppose it crazed him. I waited for no more. I ran away madly through the night and back across the bridge to the city. Next day, today, I boarded the sunken canal boat. It is the abode of death. No woman could have lived there, only such a one as she. The old man's corpse was there. He must have died long, long ago. The smell of death and of decay on the boat was dreadful. Again I felt that I understood. Back in those awful houses she had committed the crime when first she became the thing she is. And he, her father, less sin-steeped and less accursed, attempted to destroy the evidence of her crime and fled with her, but died without becoming like her. She had said that one of those two was always on watch. Did he indeed divide her vigil on the boat? What more fitting? The dead standing watch with the undead, and no wonder that she would not let me board the craft of death, even to carry her away. And still I feel the old compulsion. I have been spared her kiss but for a little while, yet I will not let the power of my oath to her draw me back, till I enter the caverns with her, and creep forth in the form of a bat, to prey upon mankind. Before that can happen, I too will die. Today in the city I heard that a horde of strange insects or small animals infested the pleasure camps last night. Some said with horror-bated breath that they perhaps were rats. None of them was seen, but in the morning nearly every camper had a strange deep wound in his throat. I almost laughed aloud. They were so horrified at the idea of an army of rats creeping into the tents and biting the sleeping occupants on their throats. If they had seen what I saw, if they knew that they are doomed to spread corruption. So my own death will not be enough. Today I bought supplies for blasting. Tonight I will set my train of dynamite, from the hole I made in the cliff where the vampires creep in and out, along the row of tents as far as the last one. Then I shall light my fuse. It will be done before the dawn. Tomorrow the city will mourn its dead and execrate my name. And then, at last, in the slime beneath the unmoving waters of the canal, I shall find peace, but perhaps it will not be peace. For I shall seek it midway between the old boat, with its cargo of death, and the row of dismal houses where a little child was done to death when first she became the thing she is. That is my expiation. There it lay on the desk in front of me, that missive, so simple in wording yet so perplexing, so urgent in tone. Jack, come at once for old time's sake. Am all alone. Will explain upon arrival. Remsen. Having spent the past 3 weeks in bringing to a successful termination a case that had puzzled the police and 2 of the best detective agencies in the city, I decided I was entitled to a rest. So I ordered 2 grips packed and went in search of a timetable. It was several years since I had seen Remsen Holroyd. In fact, I had not seen him since we had matriculated from college together. I was curious to know how he was getting along, to say nothing of the little diversion he promised me in the way of a mystery. The following afternoon found me standing on the station platform of the little town of Charing, a village of about 1,500 souls. Remsen's place was about 10 miles from there, so I stepped forward to the driver of a shay and asked if he would kindly take me to the Holroyd estate. He clasped his hands in what seemed to be a silent prayer, shuddered slightly, then looked at me with an air of wonder, mingled with suspicion. "I don't know what ye wants to go out there for, stranger, but if ye'll take the advice of a God-fearing man, ye'll turn back where ye come from. There be some mighty fearful tales concerning that place floating around, and more than one tramp's been found near there, so weak from loss of blood and fear he could hardly crawl. There's something there. Be it man or beast I don't know, but as for me, I wouldn't drive ye out there for $100, cash." This was not at all encouraging, but I was not to be influenced by the talk of a superstitious old gossip, so I cast about for a less impressionable rustic who would undertake the trip to earn the ample reward I promised at the end of the ride. To my chagrin, they all acted like the first. Some crossed themselves fervently, while others gave me one wild look and ran, as if I were in alliance with the devil. By now my curiosity was thoroughly aroused, and I was determined to see the thing through to a finish if it cost me my life. So, casting a last contemptuous look on those poor, misguided souls, I stepped out briskly in the direction pointed out to me. However, I had gone but a scant 2 miles when the weight of the valises began to tell, and I slackened pace considerably. The sun was just disappearing beneath the treetops when I caught my first glimpse of the old homestead, now deserted but for its one occupant. Time and the elements had laid heavy hands upon it, for there was hardly a window that could boast its full quota of panes, while the shutters banged and creaked with a noise dismal enough to daunt even the strong of heart. About 100 yards back, I discerned a small building built of grey stone, pieces of which seemed to be lying all around it, partly covered by the dense growth of vegetation that overran the entire countryside. On closer observation, I realized that the building was a crypt, while what I had taken to be pieces of the material scattered around were really tombstones. Evidently this was the family burying ground, but why had certain members been interred in a mausoleum, while the remainder of the family had been buried in the ground in the usual manner? Having observed thus much, I turned my steps toward the house, for I had no intention of spending the night with naught but the dead for company. Indeed, I began to realize just why those simple country folk had refused to aid me, and a hesitant doubt began to assert itself as to the expediency of my being here, when I might have been at the shore, or at the country club, enjoying life to the full. By now the sun had completely slid from view, and in the semi-darkness the place presented an even drearier aspect than before. With a great display of bravado I stepped upon the veranda, slammed my grips upon a seat, very much the worse for wear, and pulled lustily at the knob. Peal after peal reverberated throughout the house, echoing and re-echoing from room to room till the whole structure rang. Then all was still once more, save for the sighing of the wind and the creaking of the shutters. A few minutes passed, and the sound of footsteps approaching the door reached my ears. Another interval, and the door was cautiously opened a few inches, while a head, shrouded by the darkness, scrutinized me closely. Then the door was flung wide, and Remsen, I hardly knew him, so changed was he, rushed forward and, throwing his arms around me, thanked me again and again for heeding his plea, till I thought he would go into hysterics. I begged him to brace up, and the sound of my voice seemed to help him, for he apologized rather shamefacedly for his discourtesy, and led the way along the white hall. There was a fire blazing merrily in the sitting room, and after partaking generously of a repast, for I was famished after my long walk, I was seated in front of it, facing Remsen and waiting to hear his story. "Jack," he began, "I'll start at the beginning and try to give you the facts in their proper sequence. 5 years ago, my family circle consisted of 5 persons: my grandfather, my father, 2 brothers, and myself, the baby of the family. My mother died, you know, when I was a baby. Now," his voice broke, and for a moment he was unable to continue. "There's only myself left," he went on, "and so help me God, I am going too, unless you can solve the damnable mystery that hovers over this house, and put an end to that something which took my kin and is gradually taking me. Grandad was the first to go. He spent the last few years of his life in South America. Just before leaving there, he was attacked while asleep by one of those huge bats. Next morning he was so weak he couldn't walk. That awful thing had sucked his lifeblood away. He arrived here, but was sickly until his death, a few weeks later. The medicos couldn't agree as to the cause of death, so they laid it to old age and let it go at that. But I knew better. It was his experience in the South that had done for him. In his will, he asked that a crypt be built immediately and his body interred therein. His wish was carried out, and his remains lie in that little grey vault that you may have noticed if you cut around behind the house. Then my dad began failing and just pined away until he died. What puzzled the doctors was the fact that right up until the end he consumed enough food to sustain 3 men. Yet he was so weak he lacked the strength to drag his legs over the floor. He was buried, or rather interred, with Grandad. The same symptoms were in evidence in the cases of George and Fred. They are both lying in the vault. And now, Jack, I'm going too, for of late my appetite has increased to alarming proportions, yet I am as weak as a kitten." "Nonsense," I chided. "We'll just leave this place for a while and take a trip somewhere, and when you return you'll laugh at your fears. It's all a case of overwrought nerves, and there is certainly nothing strange about the deaths you speak of. They are probably due to some hereditary disease. More than one family has passed out in a hurry just on that account." "Jack, I only wish I could think so. But somehow I know better, and as for leaving here, I just can't get away. There is a morbid fascination about the place, which holds me. If you want to be a real friend, just stick around for a couple of days, and if you don't find anything, I'm sure the sight of you and the sound of your voice will do wonders for me." I agreed to do my best, although I was hard put to keep from smiling at his fears, so apparently groundless were they. We talked on other subjects for several hours. Then I proposed bed, saying that I was very tired after my journey and subsequent walk. Remsen showed me to my room, and, after seeing that everything was as comfortable as possible, he bade me good night. As he turned to leave the room, the flickering light from the lamp fell on his neck, and I noticed 2 small punctures in the skin. I questioned him regarding them, but he replied that he must have beheaded a pimple and that he hadn't noticed them before. He again said good night and left the room. I undressed and tumbled into bed. During the night I was conscious of an overpowering feeling of suffocation, as if some great burden was lying on my chest which I could not dislodge. And in the morning, when I awoke, I experienced a curious sensation of weakness. I arose, not without an effort, and began divesting myself of my sleeping suit. As I folded the jacket, I noticed a thin line of blood on the collar. I felt my neck, a terrible fear overwhelming me. It pained slightly at the touch. I rushed to examine it in the mirror. 2 tiny dots rimmed with blood. My blood! And on my neck! No longer did I chuckle at Remsen's fears, for it, the thing, had attacked me as I slept. I dressed as quickly as my condition would permit and went downstairs, thinking to find my friend there. He was not about, so I looked about outside, but he was not in evidence. There was but one answer to the question. He had not yet arisen. It was 9 o'clock, so I resolved to awaken him. Not knowing which room he occupied, I entered one after another in a fruitless search. They were all in various stages of disorder, and the thick coating of dust on the furniture showed that they had been untenanted for some time. At last, in a bedroom on the north side of the 3rd floor, I found him. He was lying spread-eagle fashion across the bed, still in his pyjamas, and as I leaned forward to shake him, my eyes fell on 2 drops of blood, spattered on the coverlet. I crushed back a wild desire to scream, and shook Remsen rather roughly. His head rolled to one side, and the hellish perforations on his throat showed up vividly. They looked fresh and raw, and had increased to much greater dimensions. I shook him with increased vigour, and at last he opened his eyes stupidly and looked around. Then, seeing me, he said in a voice loaded with anguish, resignation, and despair, "It's been here again, Jack. I can't hold out much longer. May God take my soul when I go." So saying, he fell back again from sheer weakness. I left him and went about preparing myself some breakfast. I had thought it best not to destroy his faith in me by telling him that I, too, had suffered at the hands of his persecutor. A walk brought me some peace of mind, if not a solution, and when I returned about noon to the big house, Remsen was up and around. Together we prepared a really excellent meal. I was hungry and did justice to my share, but after I had finished, my friend continued eating until I thought he must either disgorge or burst. Then, after putting things to rights, we strolled about the long hall, looking at the oil paintings, many of which were very valuable. At one end of the hall I discovered a portrait of an old gentleman, evidently a Beau Brummel in his day. He wore his hair in the long flowing fashion adopted by the old school, and sported a carefully trimmed moustache and Van Dyke beard. Remsen noticed my interest in the painting and came forward. "I don't wonder that picture holds your interest, Jack. It has a great fascination for me also. At times I sit for hours studying the expression on that face. I sometimes think he has something to tell me, but of course that's all tommyrot. But I beg your pardon, I haven't introduced the old gent yet, have I? This is my grandad. He was a great old boy in his day, and he might be living yet but for that cursed bloodsucker. Perhaps it is such a creature that's doing for me. What do you think?" "I wouldn't like to venture an opinion, Remsen, but unless I'm badly mistaken, we must dig deeper for an explanation. We'll know tonight, however. You retire as usual, and I'll keep a close watch, and we'll solve the riddle, or die in the attempt." Remsen said not a word, but silently extended his hand. I clasped it in a firm embrace, and in each other's eyes we read complete understanding. To change the trend of thought, I questioned him on the servant problem. "I've tried time and again to get servants that would stay," he replied, "but about the third day they would begin acting queer, and the first thing I'd know they'd have skipped, bag and baggage. That night I accompanied my friend to his room, and remained until he had disrobed and was ready to retire. Several of the window panes were cracked, and one was entirely missing. I suggested boarding up the aperture, but he declined, saying that he rather enjoyed the night air, so I dropped the matter. As it was still early, I sat by the fire in the sitting room, and read for an hour or two. I confess that there were many times when my mind wandered from the printed page before me, and chills raced up and down my spine as some new sound was borne to my ears. The wind had risen, and was whistling through the trees with a peculiar whining sound. The creaking of the shutters tended to further the eerie effect, and in the distance could be heard the hooting of numerous owls, mingled with the cries of miscellaneous night-fowl and other nocturnal creatures. As I ascended the 2 flights of steps, the candle in my hand casting grotesque shadows on the walls and ceiling, I had little liking for my job. Many times in the course of duty I had been called upon to display courage, but it took more than mere courage to keep me going now. I extinguished the candle and crept forward to Remsen's room, the door of which was closed. Being careful to make no noise, I knelt and looked in at the keyhole. It afforded me a clear view of the bed and 2 of the windows in the opposite wall. Gradually, my eyes became accustomed to the darkness, and I noticed a faint reddish glow outside one of the windows. It apparently emanated from nowhere. Hundreds of little specks danced and whirled in the spot of light, and as I watched them, fascinated, they seemed to take on the form of a human face. The features were masculine, as was also the arrangement of the hair. Then the mysterious glow disappeared. So great had the strain been on me that I was wet from perspiration, although the night was cool. For a moment I was undecided whether to enter the room or to stay where I was and use the keyhole as a means of observation. I concluded that to remain where I was would be the better plan, so I once more placed my eye to the hole. Immediately my attention was drawn to something moving where the light had been. At first, owing to the poor light, I was unable to distinguish the general outline and form of the thing. Then I saw. It was a man's head. So help me God, it was the exact reproduction of that picture I had seen in the hall that very morning. But oh, the difference in expression. The lips were drawn back in a snarl, disclosing 2 sets of pearly white teeth, the canines overdeveloped and remarkably sharp. The eyes, an emerald green in colour, stared in a look of consuming hate. The hair was sadly disarranged, while on the beard was a large clot of what seemed to be congealed blood. I noticed thus much. Then the head melted from my sight, and I transferred my attention to a great bat that circled round and round, his huge wings beating a tattoo on the panes. Finally he circled around the broken pane and flew straight through the hole made by the missing glass. For a few moments he was shut off from my view. Then he reappeared and began circling around my friend, who lay sound asleep, blissfully ignorant of all that was occurring. Nearer and nearer it drew, then swooped down and fastened itself on Remsen's throat, just over the jugular vein. At this I rushed into the room and made a wild dash for the thing that had come, night after night, to gorge itself on my friend, but to no avail. It flew out of the window and away, and I turned my attention to the sleeper. "Remsen, old man, get up." He sat up like a shot. "What's the matter, Jack? Has it been here?" "Never mind just now," I replied. "Just dress as hurriedly as possible. We have a little work before us this evening." He glanced questioningly toward me, but followed my command without argument. I turned and cast my eye about the room for a suitable weapon. There was a stout stick lying in the corner, and I made toward it. "Jack," I wheeled about. "What is it? Damn it all, haven't you any sense? Almost scaring a man to death." He pointed a shaking finger toward the window. "There. I swear I saw him. It was my granddad, but oh, how disfigured." He threw himself upon the bed and began sobbing. The shock had completely unnerved him. "Forgive me, old man," I pleaded. "I was too quick. Pull yourself together, and we may yet get to the bottom of things tonight." When he had finished dressing, we left the house. There was no moon out, and it was pitch dark. I led the way, and soon we came to within 10 yards of the little grey crypt. I stationed Remsen behind a tree, with instructions to just use his eyes, and I took up my stand on the other side of the vault, after making sure that the door into it was closed and locked. For the greater part of an hour we waited without results, and I was about ready to call it off when I perceived a white figure flitting between the trees about 50 feet away. Slowly it advanced, straight toward us, and as it drew closer I looked, not at it, but through it. The wind was blowing strongly, yet not a fold in the long shroud quivered. Just outside the vault it paused and looked around. Even knowing as I did about what to expect, it was a decided shock when I looked into the eyes of the old Holroyd, deceased these past 5 years. I heard a gasp, and knew that Remsen had seen too and recognized. Then the spirit, ghost or whatever it was, passed into the crypt through the crack between the door and the jamb, a space not 1/16 of an inch wide. As it disappeared, Remsen came running forward, his face wholly drawn of colour. "What was it, Jack? What was it? I know it resembled Grandad, but it couldn't have been he. He's been dead 5 years." "Let us go back to the house," I answered, "and I'll explain things to the best of my ability. I may be wrong, of course, but it won't hurt to try my remedy. Remsen, what we are up against is a vampire. Not the female species usually spoken of today, but the real thing. I noticed you had an old edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. If you'll bring me volume 24th, I'll be able to explain more fully the meaning of the word." He left the room and returned carrying the desired book. Turning to page 52, I read, "Vampire. A term apparently of Servian origin, originally applied in Eastern Europe to blood-sucking ghosts, but in modern usage transferred to one or more species of blood-sucking bats inhabiting South America. In the first mentioned meaning, a vampire is usually supposed to be the soul of a dead man, which quits the buried body by night to suck the blood of living persons. Hence, when the vampire's grave is opened, his corpse is found to be fresh and rosy from the blood thus absorbed. They are accredited with the power of assuming any form they may so desire, and often fly about as specks or dust, pieces of down or straw, etc. To put an end to his ravages, a stake is driven through him, or his head cut off, or his heart torn out, or boiling water and vinegar poured over the grave. The persons who turn vampires are wizards, witches, suicides, and those who have come to a violent end. Also, the death of any one resulting from these vampires will cause that person to join their hellish throng. See Caliomet's dissertation on the vampires of Hungary. I looked at Remsen. He was staring straight into the fire. I knew that he realized the task before us and was steeling himself to it. Then he turned to me. "Jack, we'll wait until morning." That was all. I understood, and he knew. There we sat, each struggling with his own thoughts, until the first faint glimmers of light came struggling through the trees and warned us of approaching dawn. Remsen left to fetch a sledgehammer and a large knife with its edge honed to a razor-like keenness. I busied myself making 4 wooden stakes, shaped like wedges. He returned, bearing the horrible tools, and we struck out toward the crypt. We walked rapidly, for had either of us hesitated an instant, I verily believe both would have fled incontinently. However, our duty lay clearly before us. Remsen unlocked the door and swung it outward. With a prayer on our lips, we entered. As if by mutual understanding, we both turned toward the coffin on our left. It belonged to the grandfather. We displaced the lid, and there lay the old Holroyd. He appeared to be sleeping. His face was full of colour, and he had none of the stiffness of death. The hair was matted, the moustache untrimmed, and on the beard were stains of a dull brownish hue. But it was his eyes that attracted me. They were greenish, and they glowed with an expression of fiendish malevolence such as I had never seen before. The look of baffled rage on the face might well have adorned the features of the devil in his hell. Remsen swayed and would have fallen, but I forced some whiskey down his throat, and he took a grip on himself. He placed one of the stakes directly over its heart, then shut his eyes and prayed that the good God above take this soul that was to be delivered unto him. I took a step backward, aimed carefully, and swung the sledge with all my strength. It hit the wedge squarely, and a terrible scream filled the place, while the blood gushed out of the open wound, up and over us, staining the walls and our clothes. Without hesitating, I swung again, and again, and again, while it struggled vainly to rid itself of that awful instrument of death. Another swing, and the stake was driven through. The thing squirmed about in the narrow confines of the coffin, much after the manner of a dismembered worm, and Remsen proceeded to sever the head from the body, making a rather crude but effectual job of it. As the final stroke of the knife cut the connection, a scream issued from the mouth, and the whole corpse fell away into dust, leaving nothing but a wooden stake lying in a bed of bones. This finished, we dispatched the remaining 3. Simultaneously, as if struck by the same thought, we felt our throats. The slight pain was gone from mine, and the wounds had entirely disappeared from my friends, leaving not even a scar. I wished to place before the world the whole facts, contingent upon the mystery and the solution, but Remsen prevailed upon me to hold my peace. Some years later, Remsen died a Christian death, and with him went the only confirmation of my tale. However, 10 miles from the little town of Chering, there sits an old house, forgotten these many years, and near it is a little grey crypt. Within are 4 coffins, and in each lies a wooden stake stained a brownish hue, and bearing the fingerprints of the deceased Remsen Holroyd. The child began to cry in the early afternoon, about 3 o'clock to be exact. I remember the hour because I had been listening with secret relief to the sound of the departing carriage, those wheels fading into the distance down the gravel drive with Mrs. Frenay and her daughter Gladys, to whom I was governess, meant for me some hours' welcome rest, and the June day was oppressively hot. Moreover, there was this excitement in the little country household that had told upon us all, but especially upon myself. This excitement, running delicately behind all the events of the morning, was due to some mystery, and the mystery was of course kept concealed from the governess. I had exhausted myself with guessing and keeping on the watch, for some deep and unexplained anxiety possessed me, so that I kept thinking of my sister's dictum that I was really much too sensitive to make a good governess, and that I should have done far better as a professional clairvoyante. Mr. Frayne, senior Uncle Frank, was expected for an unusual visit from town about tea-time. That I knew. I also knew that his visit was concerned somehow with the future welfare of little Jamie, Gladys's 7-year-old brother. More than this, indeed, I never knew, and this missing link makes my story in a fashion incoherent. An important bit of the strange puzzle left out. I only gathered that the visit of Uncle Frank was of a condescending nature, that Jamie was told he must be upon his very best behaviour to make a good impression, and that Jamie, who had never seen his uncle, dreaded him horribly, already in advance. Then, trailing thinly through the dying crunch of the carriage wheels this sultry afternoon, I heard the curious little wail of the child's crying, with the effect, wholly unaccountable, that every nerve in my body shot its bolt electrically, bringing me to my feet with a tingling of unequivocal alarm. Positively the water ran into my eyes. I recalled his white distress that morning when told that Uncle Frank was motoring down for tea, and that he was to be very nice indeed to him. It had gone into me like a knife. All through the day, indeed, had run this nightmare quality of terror and vision. "The man with the enormous face?" he had asked in a little voice of awe, and then gone speechless from the room in tears that no amount of soothing management could calm. That was all I saw, and what he meant by the enormous face gave me only a sense of vague presentiment. But it came as anticlimax somehow, a sudden revelation of the mystery and excitement that pulsed beneath the quiet of the stifling summer day. I feared for him, for of all that commonplace household I loved Jamie best, though professionally I had nothing to do with him. He was a high-strung, ultra-sensitive child, and it seemed to me that no one understood him, least of all his honest, tender-hearted parents. So that his little wailing voice brought me from my bed to the window in a moment, like a call for help. The haze of June lay over that big garden like a blanket. The wonderful flowers, which were Mr. Frene's delight, hung motionless. The lawn, so soft and thick, cushioned all other sounds. Only the limes and huge clumps of guelder roses hummed with bees. Through this muted atmosphere of heat and haze, the sound of the child's crying floated faintly to my ears. From a distance, indeed, I wonder now that I heard it at all, for the next moment I saw him down beyond the garden, standing in his white sailor suit alone, 200 yards away. He was down by the ugly patch where nothing grew, the forbidden corner. A faintness then came over me at once, a faintness as of death, when I saw him there of all places, where he never was allowed to go, and where, moreover, he was usually too terrified to go. To see him standing solitary in that singular spot, above all to hear him crying there, bereft me momentarily of the power to act. Then, before I could recover my composure sufficiently to call him in, Mr. Frayne came round the corner from the lower farm with the dogs, and, seeing his son, performed that office for me. In his loud, good-natured, hearty voice he called him, and Jamie turned and ran as though some spell had broken just in time, ran into the open arms of his fond but uncomprehending father, who carried him indoors on his shoulder, while asking what all this hubbub was about. And at their heels the tailless sheepdogs followed, barking loudly, and performing what Jamie called their gravel dance, because they ploughed up the moist, rolled gravel with their feet. I stepped back swiftly from the window, lest I should be seen. Had I witnessed the saving of the child from fire or drowning, the relief could hardly have been greater. Only Mr. Frene, I felt sure, would not say and do the right thing quite. He would protect the boy from his own vain imaginings, yet not with the explanation that could really heal. They disappeared behind the rose trees, making for the house. I saw no more till later, when Mr. Frene Senior arrived. To describe the ugly patch as singular is hard to justify, perhaps, yet some such word is what the entire family sought, though never, oh, never, used. To Jamie and myself, though equally we never mentioned it, that treeless, flowerless spot was more than singular. It stood at the far end of the magnificent rose garden, a bald, sore place, where the black earth showed ugly in winter, almost like a piece of dangerous bog, and in summer baked and cracked with fissures where green lizards shot their fire in passing. In contrast to the rich luxuriance of death amid life, a centre of disease that cried for healing lest it spread. Behind it stood the thick wood of silver birches, and, glimmering beyond, the orchard meadow, where the lambs played. The gardeners had a very simple explanation of its barrenness, that the water all drained off it, owing to the lie of the slopes immediately about it, holding no remnant to keep the soil alive. I cannot say. It was Jamie who felt its spell and haunted it, who spent whole hours there, even while afraid, and for whom it was finally labelled strictly out of bounds, because it stimulated his already big imagination, not wisely but too darkly. It was Jamie who buried ogres there, and heard it crying in an earthy voice, swore that it shook its surface sometimes while he watched it, and secretly gave it food in the form of birds or mice or rabbits he found dead upon his wanderings. And it was Jamie who put so extraordinarily into words the feeling that the horrid spot had given me from the moment I first saw it. "It's bad, Miss Gould," he told me. "But, Jamie, nothing in nature is bad, exactly. Only different from the rest sometimes. Miss Gould, if you please, then, it's empty, it's not fed. It's dying because it can't get the food it wants. And when I stared into the little pale face, where the eyes shone so dark and wonderful, seeking within myself for the right thing to say to him, he added, with an emphasis and conviction that made me suddenly turn cold, "Miss Gould." He always used my name like this in all his sentences. "It's hungry, don't you see? But I know what would make it feel all right." Only the conviction of an earnest child, perhaps, could have made so outrageous a suggestion worth listening to for an instant. But for me, who felt that things an imaginative child believed were important, it came with a vast disquieting shock of reality. Jamie, in this exaggerated way, had caught at the edge of a shocking fact. A hint of dark, undiscovered truth had leaped into that sensitive imagination. Why there lay horror in the words I cannot say, but I think some power of darkness trooped across the suggestion of that sentence at the end. I know what would make it feel all right. I remember that I shrank from asking explanation. Small groups of other words, veiled fortunately by his silence, gave life to an unspeakable possibility that hitherto had lain at the back of my own consciousness. The way it sprang to life proves, I think, that my mind already contained it. The blood rushed from my heart as I listened. I remember that my knees shook. Jamie's idea had been all along, my own as well. And now, as I lay down on my bed and thought about it all, I understood why the coming of his uncle involved somehow an experience that wrapped terror at its heart, with a sense of nightmare certainty that left me too weak to resist the preposterous idea, too shocked indeed to argue or reason it away. This certainty came with its full black blast of conviction, and the only way I can put it into words, since nightmare horror really is not properly tellable at all, seems this: that there was something missing in that dying patch of garden, something lacking that it ever searched for, something once found and taken that would turn it rich and living as the rest. More, that there was some living person who could do this for it. Mr. Friend, Senior, in a word, Uncle Frank, was this person who out of his abundant life could supply the lack, unwittingly. For this connection between the dying, empty patch and the person of this vigorous, wealthy, and successful man had already lodged itself in my subconsciousness before I was aware of it. Clearly it must have lain there all along, though hidden. Jamie's words, his sudden pallor, his vibrating emotion of fearful anticipation had developed the plate, but it was his weeping alone, there in the forbidden corner, that had printed it. The photograph shone, framed before me in the air. I hid my eyes, but for the redness, the charm of my face goes to pieces unless my eyes are clear. I could have cried. Jamie's words that morning about the enormous face came back upon me like a battering ram. Mr. Frenet Senior had been so frequently the subject of conversation in the family since I came. I had so often heard him discussed, and had then read so much about him in the papers. His energy, his philanthropy, his success with everything he laid his hand to, that a picture of the man had grown complete within me. I knew him as he was, within, or, as my sister would have said, clairvoyantly. And the only time I saw him, when I took Gladys to a meeting where he was chairman, and later felt his atmosphere and presence while for a moment he patronizingly spoke with her, had justified the portrait I had drawn. The rest, you may say, was a woman's wild imagining, but I think rather it was that kind of divining intuition which women share with children. If souls could be made visible, I would stake my life upon the truth and accuracy of my portrait. For this Mr. Frame was a man who drooped alone but grew vital in a crowd, because he used their vitality. He was a supreme, unconscious artist in the science of taking the fruits of others' work and living for his own advantage. He vampired, unknowingly no doubt, everyone with whom he came in contact, left them exhausted, tired, listless. Others fed him, so that while in a full room he shone, alone by himself and with no life to draw upon, he languished and declined. In the man's immediate neighborhood you felt his presence draining you. He took your ideas, your strength, your very words, and later used them for his own benefit and aggrandizement. Not evilly, of course, the man was good enough, but you felt that he was dangerous, owing to the facile way he absorbed into himself all loose vitality that was to be had. His eyes and voice and presence devitalized you. Life, it seemed, not highly organized enough to resist, must shrink from his too near approach, and hide away for fear of being appropriated, for fear, that is, of death. Jamie unknowingly put in the finishing touch to my unconscious portrait. The man carried about with him some silent, compelling trick of drawing out all your reserves, then swiftly pocketing them. At first you would be conscious of taut resistance. This would slowly shade off into weariness. The will would become flaccid. Then you either moved away or yielded, agreed to all he said with a sense of weakness, pressing ever closer upon the edges of collapse. With a male antagonist it might be different, but even then the effort of resistance would generate force that he absorbed, and not the other. He never gave out. Some instinct taught him how to protect himself from that. To human beings, I mean, he never gave out. This time it was a very different matter. He had no more chance than a fly before the wheels of a huge, what Jamie used to call, a traction engine. So this was how I saw him. A great human sponge, crammed and soaked with the life, or proceeds of life, absorbed from others, stolen. My idea of a human vampire was satisfied. He went about carrying these accumulations of the life of others. In this sense, his life was not really his own. For the same reason, I think, it was not so fully under his control as he imagined. And in another hour this man would be here. I went to the window. My eye wandered to the empty patch, dull black there amid the rich luxuriance of the garden flowers. It struck me as a hideous bit of emptiness, yawning to be filled and nourished. The idea of Jamie playing round its bare edge was loathsome. I watched the big summer clouds above, the stillness of the afternoon, the haze. The silence of the overheated garden was oppressive. I had never felt a day so stifling, motionless. It lay there waiting. The household, too, was waiting for the coming of Mr. Frayne from London in his big motor car. And I shall never forget the sensation of icy shrinking and distress with which I heard the rumble of the car. He had arrived. Tea was already on the lawn beneath the lime trees, and Mrs. Frayne and Gladys, back from their drive, were sitting in wicker chairs. Mr. Frayne Jr. was in the hall to meet his brother. But Jamie, as I learned afterwards, had shown such hysterical alarm, offered such bold resistance, that it had been deemed wiser to keep him in his room. Perhaps, after all, his presence might not be necessary. The visit clearly had to do with something on the uglier side of life. Money, settlements, or what not, I never knew exactly. Only that his parents were anxious, and that Uncle Frank had to be propitiated. It does not matter. That has nothing to do with the affair. What has to do with it, or I should not be telling the story, is that Mrs. Friend sent for me to come down in my nice white dress, if I did mind, and that I was terrified, yet pleased, because it meant that a pretty face would be considered a welcome addition to the visitor's landscape. Also, most odd it was, I felt my presence was somehow inevitable, that in some way it was intended that I should witness what I did witness, and the instant I came upon the lawn, I hesitate to set it down, it sounds so foolish, disconnected. I could have sworn, as my eyes met his, that a kind of sudden darkness came taking the summer brilliance out of everything, and that it was caused by troops of small black horses that raced about us from his person, to attack. After a first momentary approving glance, he took no further notice of me. The tea and talk went smoothly. I helped to pass the plates and cups, filling in pauses with little undertalk to Gladys. Jamie was never mentioned. Outwardly all seemed well, but inwardly everything was awful, skirting the edge of things unspeakable, and so charged with danger that I could not keep my voice from trembling when I spoke. I watched his hard, bleak face. I noticed how thin he was, and the curious, oily brightness of his steady eyes. They did not glitter, but they drew you with a sort of soft, creamy shine like Eastern eyes, and everything he said or did announced what I may dare to call the suction of his presence. His nature achieved this result automatically. He dominated us all, yet so gently that until it was accomplished no one noticed it. Before 5 minutes had passed, however, I was aware of one thing only. My mind focused exclusively upon it, and so vividly that I marveled the others did not scream or run or do something violent to prevent it. And it was this, that separated merely by some dozen yards or so, this man, vibrating with the acquired vitality of others, stood within easy reach of that spot of yawning emptiness, waiting and eager to be filled. Earth scented her prey. These two active centres were within fighting distance. He so thin, so hard, so keen, yet really spreading large with the loose surround of others' life he had appropriated, so practised and triumphant, that others so patient, deep, with so mighty a draw of the whole earth behind it, and, so obviously aware that its opportunity at last had come. I saw it all as plainly as though I watched two great animals prepare for battle, both unconsciously. Yet, in some inexplicable way, I saw it, of course, within me, and not externally. The conflict would be hideously unequal. Each side had already sent out emissaries, how long before I could not tell, for the first evidence he gave that something was going wrong with him was when his voice grew suddenly confused. He missed his words, and his lips trembled a moment and turned flabby. The next second his face betrayed that singular and horrid change, growing somehow loose about the bones of the cheek, and larger, so that I remembered Jamie's miserable phrase. The emissaries of the two kingdoms, the human and the vegetable, had met, I make it out, in that very second. For the first time in his long career of battening on others, Mr. Friend found himself pitted against a vaster kingdom than he knew, and, so finding, shook inwardly in that little part that was his definite, actual self. He felt the huge disaster coming. "Yes, John," he was saying in his drawling, self-congratulating voice. "Sir George gave me that car. Gave it to me as a present. Wasn't it char?" And then broke off abruptly, stammered, drew breath, stood up and looked uneasily about him. For a second there was a gaping pause. It was like the click which starts some huge machinery moving. That instant's pause before it actually starts. The whole thing, indeed, then went with the rapidity of machinery running down and beyond control. I thought of a giant dynamo working silently and invisible. "What's that?" he cried, in a soft voice charged with alarm. "What's that horrid place? And someone's crying there. Who is it?" He pointed to the empty patch. Then, before anyone could answer, he started across the lawn towards it, going every minute faster. Before anyone could move, he stood upon the edge. He leaned over, peering down into it. It seemed a few hours passed, but really they were seconds, for time is measured by the quality and not the quantity of sensations it contains. I saw it all with merciless photographic detail, sharply etched amid the general confusion. Each side was intensely active, but only one side, the human, exerted all its force in resistance. The other merely stretched out a feeler, as it were, from its vast potential strength. No more was necessary. It was such a soft and easy victory. Oh, it was rather pitiful. There was no bluster or great effort, on one side at least. Close by his side I witnessed it, for I, it seemed, alone had moved and followed him. No one else stirred, though Mrs. Friend clattered noisily with the cups, making some sudden impulsive gesture with her hands, and Gladys, I remember, gave a cry. It was like a little scream. "Oh, Mother, it's the heat, isn't it?" Mr. Frayne, her father, was speechless, pale as ashes. But the instant I reached his side, it became clear what had drawn me there thus instinctively. Upon the other side, among the silver birches, stood little Jamie. He was watching. I experienced, for him, one of those moments that shake the heart. A liquid fear ran all over me, the more effective because unintelligible, really. Yet I felt that if I could know all, and what lay actually behind, my fear would be more than justified, that the thing was awful, full of awe. And then it happened, a truly wicked sight, like watching a universe in action, yet all contained within a small square foot of space. I think he understood vaguely that if someone could only take his place, he might be saved, and that was why, discerning instinctively the easiest substitute within reach, he saw the child and called aloud to him across the empty patch. "James, my boy, come here." His voice was like a thin report, but somehow flat and lifeless, as when a rifle misses fire, sharp yet weak. It had no crack in it. It was really supplication. And, with amazement, I heard my own ring out, imperious and strong, though I was not conscious of saying it. "Jamie, don't move. Stay where you are." But Jamie, the little child, obeyed neither of us. Moving up nearer to the edge, he stood there, laughing. I heard that laughter, but could have sworn it did not come from him. The empty, yawning patch gave out that sound. Mr. Frenet turned sideways, throwing up his arms. I saw his hard, bleak face grow somehow wider, spread through the air and downwards. A similar thing I saw was happening at the same time to his entire person, for it drew out into the atmosphere in a stream of movement. The face for a second made me think of those toys of green India rubber that children pull. It grew enormous. But this was an external impression only. What actually happened, I clearly understood, was that all this vitality and life he had transferred from others to himself for years was now, in turn, being taken from him and transferred elsewhere. One moment on the edge he wobbled horribly, then with that queer sideways motion, rapid yet ungainly, he stepped forward into the middle of the patch and fell heavily upon his face. His eyes, as he dropped, faded shockingly, and across the countenance was written plainly what I can only call an expression of destruction. He looked utterly destroyed. I caught a sound. From Jamie? But this time not of laughter. It was like a gulp. It was deep and muffled, and it dipped away into the earth. Again I thought of a troop of small black horses galloping away down a subterranean passage beneath my feet, plunging into the depths, their tramping growing fainter and fainter into buried distance. In my nostrils was a pungent smell of earth. And then all passed. I came back into myself. Mr. Frayne Jr. was lifting his brother's head from the lawn where he had fallen from the heat, close beside the tea-table. He had never really moved from there, and Jamie, I learned afterwards, had been the whole time asleep upon his bed upstairs, worn out with his crying and unreasoning alarm. Gladys came running out with cold water, sponge and towel, brandy too, all kinds of things. "Mother, it was the heat, wasn't it?" I heard her whisper, but I did not catch Mrs. Frenet's reply. From her face it struck me that she was bordering on collapse herself. Then the butler followed, and they just picked him up and carried him into the house. He recovered even before the doctor came, but the queer thing to me is that I was convinced the others all had seen what I saw, only that no one said a word about it, and to this day no one has said a word. And that was, perhaps, the most horrid part of all. From that day to this, I have scarcely heard a mention of Mr. Frenet Sr. It seemed as if he dropped suddenly out of life. The papers never mentioned him. His activities ceased, as it were. His afterlife, at any rate, became singularly ineffective. Certainly he achieved nothing worth public mention. But it may be only that, having left the employ of Mrs. Frenet, there was no particular occasion for me to hear anything. The afterlife of that empty patch of garden, however, was quite otherwise. Nothing, so far as I know, was done to it by gardeners, or in the way of draining it or bringing in new earth, but even before I left in the following summer it had changed. It lay untouched, full of great, luscious, driving weeds and creepers, very strong, full-fed, and bursting thick with life. If you enjoyed these stories, please consider subscribing and leaving a comment. Thanks for listening to The Eldritch Narrator.